Welcome to the Minnesota Board of Psychology's 2018 Spring Conference. I'm Sam Sands. I am the Executive Director of the Board of Psychology. The title of the conference is Psychologists, Self-Care, Caring for the Caregiver, and Professional Impairment. To go over the agenda, first we'll have Jack Rusinoff, who's a member of the board and the chair of one of our compliance committees. Then we'll have Monica Fider, who is the program manager for the HPSP program. Then Dr. Thomas Scoville, who is a professor in the counseling psychology program at the University of Minnesota. And then Michelle Trotter-Matheson. And both the afternoon presentations will be about professional resiliency for psychologists. Now I'll introduce Jack Rusinoff. Jack is the board's vice chair, and he is the Complaint Resolution Committee 1's chair. Jack has been a licensed psychologist since 1992 and has worked in the fields of domestic violence and sexual misconduct. He is currently at the Minnesota Department of Corrections, and he has a specialty in clinical hypnosis. And so I'd ask you to welcome Jack Rusinoff.
Well, it's so nice to see a almost full house on a very beautiful day, and I'm glad that all of you can make it. Maybe there'll be some more people come in as things go on. I'm going to talk about complaint resolution and impairment of providers and what to do about it. And I'm going to tell you some about the Complaint Resolution Committee and how that works. Does everyone recognize this book? You should. This is our Bible for the practice of psychology in Minnesota. I'm not going to ask you to say out loud, but ask yourself if you've read this in the last year or if you've consulted with it in the last year. Probably it would be a good idea to read this once a year, and probably a good idea to consult with this book when you find yourself in ethical dilemmas or other kinds of conundrums in your practice of psychology, because it has the answers. So first, a little bit about the Complaint Resolution Committee. There's two of them that the board runs. It has 3 members that are board members. Board members are appointed by the governor, and staff of the board who work at the board also attend. So the executive director, Sam, comes. Usually there is a assistant attorney general from the attorney general's office who also comes to the Complaint Resolution Committee. That person comes to board meetings too. And then our compliance specialist, Josh Bramley, and our investigator, Scott Payne, also come to the Complaint Resolution Committees. I will talk more about that in a little bit, but that's just kind of how that basically is set up. So if you think about it, if you find yourself in front of a Complaint Resolution Committee, there's 7 people or so in that room, 8 people maybe, and you have a right to have an attorney if you want one. I would say my personal experience is that attorneys maybe are good for support. They're supposed to make sure that your rights are not trampled on by the board. My experience with the Complaint Resolution Committee that I'm on is that we're not about trampling on anyone's rights. But if I was in front of the committee, I think I would probably want an attorney also just to feel supported. So they don't usually say much that sways the committee one way or the other, but they do help you feel supported and not so ganged up upon. So it's probably not a bad idea to have an attorney. If you find yourself in front of one of the committees, you will know what the allegations are ahead of time. And in order to prepare for that committee, look it up. Look up the allegations and see how you did or did not violate whatever the rules are. So disciplinary action, which comes out of the statute. When you see the 148, that's statute. When you see 7200 something, those are rules. This comes out of the statute. The board can impose disciplinary action on licensees or also applicants. As soon as you become an applicant, you're under the board's jurisdiction, applicants and licensees. And when that person has demonstrated an inability to practice psychology with reasonable skill and safety to clients due to any mental or physical illness or condition. Reasonable skill and safety is very key here. When you're practicing, think about your mental state and how you're doing, and are you able to practice with reasonable skill and safety at any given time? If you can, then you're probably not going to be in trouble. The board can direct an applicant or a licensee for evaluations if there's some question or problem that has come in front of the board. Failing to submit to that allows the board to view the allegations as true. So if someone complains and says that you have a chemical dependency problem and the board says, well, you need to get an evaluation, it's best to do that. It's also against the rules not to cooperate with board investigations. So that would be a potential violation of failing to seek a chemical dependency evaluation if you were directed to have that. There's two types of impairment. One is impaired objectivity or effectiveness, which is sort of situational. And then there is provider impairment, which is more biological or physiological. And I'm going to talk about both of those, but first I'm going to talk about impaired objectivity or effectiveness. By the way, this should be a review for everyone here. This should not be new. This is not groundbreaking. This is something everyone should be familiar with. So the purpose of my kind of summing this up is just to have it fresh in your mind, because it's always good to know this and to be aware of this stuff. And it's easy to forget it if you haven't looked at this book in a while. So impaired objectivity or effectiveness, multiple relationships. If you practice psychotherapy with someone, you can't be their landlord. You can't be their friend. You cannot be their significant other. This should go without saying, but it doesn't. And there are psychologists that get jammed up with this problem. And we see it at the Complaint Resolution Committee. We would like to not see it at the Complaint Resolution Committee. We'd like psychologists to be practicing in a way that doesn't involve this in the first place. If you do psychotherapy and assessment with someone, you also cannot be their teacher or their supervisor. You can be their supervisor and a teacher, but if that's the case, you can't do psychotherapy with them or psychological assessment with them. Back in the days of psychoanalysis, the way that worked, you had someone who was a professor, Dr. Freud, and he had people that he mentored, like Carl Jung. And he analyzed them, and he mentored them, and he taught them psychoanalysis. That wouldn't fly now. That is something that's changed, and it's not okay at this point. Why? Because it's impaired objectivity. By the way, Dr. Freud, for anyone who remembers this, insisted on all his pupils being analyzed, but no one was allowed to analyze him. He did it himself. And that was good enough. Two or more types of psychological services when a fundamental conflict arises is a no-go. So if you have someone who's an individual client and you are also providing group therapy for them, there is possibly a fundamental conflict that could arise. Same thing if you were conducting couples therapy or family therapy with someone and also doing individual therapy with them. If that happens, there's a way to deal with it, which I'll get to in a little bit. But if you continue and it's not resolved, it could be a violation of impaired objectivity. Multiple clients whose psychotherapy goals are fundamentally irreconcilable. Same thing with, if you have a group therapy program and there are people in the group that have conflicts with each other and very different goals, and someone's there who's there is very disruptive, you need to do something about that, or it could be impaired objectivity. Maybe that person needs to not be in the group, maybe that person needs to be counseled separately, maybe they need to have some kind of intervention to change their behavior in the group. When the provider has a bias for or against the client, for or against, it's not just bias against someone, it's for them, when it interferes with your impartial judgment. So this is something that psychoanalysis used to call, probably still do call, countertransference. And if you're a psychoanalyst, you're supposed to work through the countertransference. If you have someone who has radically different political views than you, and you cannot reconcile the things they talk about and whatever stance they take, that is possibly impaired objectivity if it affects your impartial judgment in how you deal with that person and how you treat them. If you have a physical attraction to someone who's a client and you're not able to deal with that and it affects your work with that person, that's an example of impartial judgment being impaired. When there's a fundamental divergence or conflict of service goals, interests, values, or attitudes that adversely affects the professional relationship. Some of these kind of overlap on each other, so they're not all exclusive. And in fact, the situational kinds of impairments that I'm talking about now sometimes overlap with the ones that are more biological. So, methods of resolution. If you find yourself in a position where you feel, maybe my impartiality is impaired right now, there are things to do about it. You can get professional education, you can get training, you can study, you can have consultation or therapy or some other intervention, processing it, talking about it, thinking about it, doing something to deal with it, supervision for it, discussing it with the client is sometimes appropriate, sometimes not, and an appropriate combination of all of those above things. So just because you might find yourself in a situation where your objectivity is impaired doesn't mean you're in trouble, doesn't mean you're going to be complained about to the board, it doesn't mean that all is lost. What you have to do is something to deal with it. Or if you can't deal with it, you have to terminate services with that client or clients. And that needs to be done according to the rules, and the burden of proof is on you as a provider that you dealt with this. So, one of the things that you can do to prove that you dealt with this is document. You need to document whatever methods you used to attempt to resolve your impaired objectivity. So it's very important to document how you dealt with this problem. Probably not surprisingly to anyone, documentation is one of the problems that healthcare professionals often get jammed up with. Lack of documentation. It's pretty easy after a full day of work to forget to document whatever you need to document and put it off, and then before you know it, you're a week or two or a month behind. So the provider shall not offer psychological services to clients when the provider is unable to offer such services with reasonable skill and safety, there's that phrase again, as a result of a physical or mental illness or condition, including but not limited to substance abuse. So this one is more biological, this type of impairment. This kind of impairment can be acute or it can be chronic. It can be something that will never resolve or something that can be resolved. And it depends on the individual, it depends on what the problem is. Certainly if someone has substance dependence issues, they can recover from that. And something that, most of the board members are psychologists. There's 2 public members. We believe in people recovering and getting better and changing. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't be psychologists. Physical illness. We have someone who is elderly and on an air tank. Maybe they have COPD. and they allegedly have fallen asleep during sessions. Well, that's a physical illness. They might be able to recover from that, or maybe they need to retire. We all experience changes in our bodies as we age. Hopefully, we all will recognize when we're too old to do something like psychotherapy. Maybe it gets to the point where doing psychological assessments is too beyond what you can do, but you can still do counseling. Well, knowing that is going to help you avoid being in trouble. Because if you do an assessment and it's faulty and the person complains, you could be in trouble for that. Mental illness. I like to think of this as more than just mental illness because that has kind of derogatory connotations. I think of it more as mental state. So, if you have a mental illness or a mental state that impairs your objectivity, you need to do something. You maybe need to get help because a lot of mental illnesses can be treated. And I know that many people who have mental illnesses feel a lot of shame about it, and they avoid going to get help. But aside from treatable mental illnesses like bipolar disorder, there are people that have personality issues, and sometimes they become psychologists, people who, for whatever reason, over the course of their career, they change how they view things. Maybe they become a little full of themselves. Maybe they forget to check their narcissism. And I'm not saying they're narcissistic personality disordered, but they kind of lose perspective. And then they start doing things that are not okay and against the Psychology Practice Act and against the rules. If you have a death in your family, some people need to take time off to grieve because they're not going to be real effective when they practice, and all their grief is right in the front of their mind. So it's a good idea to take a break at that point. Some people, maybe the way they deal with their grief is to avoid how they feel and think, and so practicing psychology might be fine for them. And they do that and it keeps their mind off of their pain. Okay, as long as it's not something that's impairing your ability to practice safely and effectively. Substance abuse. People get addicted to opiates these days. Someone has a car crash and they have back pain. They're not someone that ever tried drugs for fun. They were not a recreational marijuana smoker back in their college days. And now they're on opiates. And they find that they're addicted to it before they know it, because it's very addictive. Well, that's a problem. And if you practice psychology and you're on opiates at the same time and it's impairing your ability to practice safely and effectively, you could get in trouble. Similarly, there are people that drink alcohol and for whatever reason, it gets out of hand. Maybe they started out as a social drinker, and then eventually it's a couple of cocktails every night or most nights. If that person goes to work the next morning and feels hungover, that's probably an impairment of their ability to function correctly. So you have to know your limit. If you can't drink a glass of wine on a night when you have work the next morning and feel refreshed and relaxed and ready to go, then don't do it. If you can drink a beer or two or something like that at dinner time, and it doesn't affect your sleep, and it doesn't affect how you feel the next day, and it doesn't impair your ability to practice effectively and safely, okay, it's not a problem. So a complaint is filed, and we all have this, some of us have this preemptive kind of experience when you just think of a complaint maybe being filed against you. It's confidential. The board cannot tell you who filed it. You might know, you might think you know, but it's confidential. And the reason for that is because if it's not confidential, then that might stifle the ability of people to file complaints. I read recently that some other state, there was a move for it to be not confidential when someone filed a complaint against a medical doctor. Well, that's probably not a good idea because that stifles and chills the ability of someone to file a complaint. It can come from a variety of sources. Someone who's a staff member of the board might file a complaint. They're reviewing an application for licensure, and they see that this person's been practicing psychology with inadequate supervision. Well, they might file a complaint with the board. Clients can file complaints. Insurance companies can file complaints. Colleagues can file complaints. Your spouse or significant other can file a complaint. Anyone is allowed to do it. It's not hard to do. The board gets a lot of complaints. So when there's a complaint, there's a process, and there is a person who's an investigator, Scott Payne. If it's not a criminal matter, he investigates. If there's a criminal matter, like a complaint of criminal sexual conduct or something like that against a licensee, or insurance fraud would be another one, then the Attorney General's office gets involved, and they investigate. And they do these very in-depth interviews with all the people that are complaining and with the person that the complaint is against. That goes to the Complaint Resolution Committee. Again, it meets once every other month, and then there's another one that meets on opposite months. And when it gets to that committee at the first stage, it's called triage. The committee has these documents ahead of time. So when I have a complaint resolution committee on a Friday, sometimes like the Friday before or Monday before, or whenever it is, there's complaint information put up on a website that I can look at. And this will have information like the interview with the person that's being complained about, the complaint itself, interviews with other people who are relevant to the complaint, file materials that might be relevant, like psychological assessments or case notes or all of the above, and whatever other information has been pulled up for the review of the committee. And I read this information. There might be 10 to 20 people who have a triage complaint at any given complaint resolution committee. I read it ahead of time and I ask myself, what's the next step? Is this something where it seems like there really isn't much of basis for a complaint, or is this something that needs to be looked at a little more closely? Most of them are dismissed. If it doesn't get dismissed, there are a couple of options. One would be an additional investigation. I can't tell, and the committee can't tell, based on what we have, whether or not this is a dismissal or something else. So we ask Scott Payne and or the Assistant Attorney General to investigate it further, find some more information. One of the other places that you might get a complaint from would be another board. If you happen to have dual licensure, you're also an LMFT. If someone complains to the Licensed Marriage and Family Therapy Board, they would also complain to the Psychology Board when they know that you're also a licensed psychologist, and vice versa. So one possible outcome of the triage would be something called an educational conference. Educational conferences pretty much are not about discipline. We don't do them very, very often, but it's to kind of see what this person says in real life about the complaint, and also maybe to give them some information and some feedback. An educational conference most often results in a dismissal, but it might not. It might involve further investigation, and it might involve further disciplinary action, or go towards further disciplinary action. Or there's the discipline conference that everyone dreads, and I don't blame anyone for dreading it because it's no fun. You know, imagine the very hardest job interview you ever went to, and there was maybe 3 people interviewing you, a panel like that, and here you are in front of the Board of Psychology, staff, and board members, drilling you about your professional conduct. Well, it's not fun. One way to think about it, though, is it's similar to kind of like a peer review process. If you can honestly say to yourself, my work would withstand the scrutiny of a peer review, then you're probably not going to get in trouble. So, like I said, educational conferences typically result in dismissal. There could be a possible informal recommendation from the committee. So essentially it's kind of like, go out and sin no more. If it's a discipline conference, again, this can result in dismissal, and most of them actually do. If the person takes responsibility for it, it wasn't something that really compromised their practice, they've done things to ameliorate the problem, they demonstrate remorse, it seems as if they get it, and this was an oversight for whatever reason, and now they are not likely to repeat this again, and it didn't really hurt anyone, it could be dismissed, even if there is actually cause for finding violation. Or we can have an agreement for corrective action, which is not a formal discipline. That might be things like take a boundary class and write a paper about what you learned, take some graduate classes in ethics, do this or that, attend some kind of lecture, or have some kind of a supervisor for an hour a month for a year, or something that will correct the behavior. If you have an agreement for corrective action, it is something that becomes public, and it is something that you can see on the Board of Psychology's website. However, it's not sent to the different databases that insurance companies look at and use for people who've had actual discipline against them or against their license. And then a formal discipline is called a stipulation and consent, and that's formal disciplinary action. That one, before it goes into effect, the entire board has to meet and approve it. So the committee can recommend that someone's license is suspended for an indefinite amount of time, as an example. It doesn't just happen even if you agree with it as a licensee. It goes in front of the whole board on one of the Fridays when the board meets, and it's a session that's not open to the public. It's part of a closed meeting. And we discuss the case and hash it out and figure out if it's appropriate or not. If the board thinks it's not harsh enough or it's too harsh, then it goes back to the committee, and the committee has to come up with another solution. If it's something that's an agreement for corrective action, the whole board does not consider it. It's just the committee that considers it, and the Attorney General's office writes it up and asks the licensee or applicant to sign. If you don't agree with the agreement for corrective action or a stipulation and consent order, you can challenge that. Just because the board is imposing it doesn't mean it's the end-all and be-all and you're stuck with it. You can ask for the agreement for corrective action to be modified if you don't like the language of it or you don't like some of the conditions of it, and then the Attorney General will bring it back to the committee and see if the committee agrees or not. That's also what it's good to have a lawyer for when you're in this kind of a position. And the same thing with a stipulation and consent order. You can challenge this, and if you don't like it, you can take it in front of an administrative law judge in downtown St. Paul, and that person will hold a hearing, and they will consider all the merits of this, all the facts, and they come up with something called an order of fact, I'm not sure what it's called, facts, something that's about the facts of the case and an order of it. At that point, the board can disregard that, actually, or they can follow what the administrative law judge says. I think most of the time, probably the board goes along with what the administrative law judge says. So in 2017, between the two complaint resolution committees, there were 147 triage cases. 93 of those got dismissed outright. 40 resulted in conferences. 14 others were not resolved. There's pending more investigation. The case is pending. There was some other thing. There might have been a conference that the applicant or licensee couldn't attend for some reason or another, and it gets rescheduled. A variety of things can happen. There were 36 notices of conference, which means discipline conferences. Only seven of those resulted in a stipulation and consent order, formal discipline. 2 resulted in agreements for corrective action, which is not a formal discipline. And 27 were dismissed out of 36. That's 75% were outright dismissed for the person that was called into the board to answer about the allegations in a complaint. So if anything, please take away from this, we're not heavy-handed. We're trying to be fair. We have to protect the public. But we also know this is your occupation, this is your way of making a living, and that most psychologists take that very seriously, and most are professional and don't engage in a lot of unprofessional conduct. There were 4 educational conferences out of that 147, out of the 40 conferences. That's why it's 36 discipline conferences. And those probably, I don't have the statistics, but I believe all 4 of those were dismissed. So it's 31 out of 36 that were dismissed. In the year 2017, 6 to 7 licensees were in HPSP. I'm not going to talk about HPSP a lot because the next speaker is going to talk about that. But it is an alternative to disciplinary action by the board. If you find yourself gummed up with a chemical dependency issue, this is a place to contact and a way to deal with that problem without the board being involved with it. If you deal with it, we don't even know. The board doesn't get that information. If you go to this program and you don't comply with it, the board finds out and does know, and then you could end up with a disciplinary problem. So avoiding the complaint review panel is a good thing to practice. Dot your I's and cross your T's. Please make sure you document everything you're supposed to document. You're supposed to have a client data sheet for every client, right? You're supposed to document therapy sessions. You're supposed to document psychological and other kinds of evaluations or assessments. You're supposed to document collateral contacts. You're supposed to document consultations that you've done regarding a person that you're working with. You're supposed to document referrals that you've made. You're supposed to document everything related to your psychological service with an individual. If you didn't do it, it didn't happen because you can't prove it. We had a licensee recently who was documenting, he says, documenting his services on a laptop. Fine. His laptop, according to him, was stolen out of his car, and it had 8 years' worth of psychotherapy information. And there was a complaint against him, and he couldn't provide any kind of case notes or anything to the board regarding this. And I don't know whether I should believe him that it was all on a laptop and it was stolen or not. But the reality is he can't show us notes, he can't show us anything related to his practice of psychology. So it didn't happen. He could say, I consulted with my colleague Bruce, and this is what Bruce said regarding my work with this client who has complained against me, but there's no way to show that that happened because there's no notes. How come he didn't have backup? It's not expensive to buy a flash drive. It's not expensive to buy an external hard disk. It's not that expensive to have cloud services. Make sure that if you have something like cloud services that it's secure and it conforms to HIPAA. But in this day and age, you know, most people do their work with a computer, and that's fine. But you have to be able to prove that you did the work. And if it's gone, and then it's as if it didn't happen. So that person ends up with some problems. Know the rules. It needs to be repeated over and over because I'm willing to bet that there's a significant percentage of everyone sitting here who hasn't looked at this book in the last year. And if you don't know what the rules are, then it's easy to not follow them. And if you don't follow the rules, it's on you. If you didn't know that there was a stop sign and you go through it, you could get a ticket for going through a stop sign. It doesn't matter whether or not you saw it. It's up to you to know it was there. And it's the same thing with the rules for practicing psychology. Proactive consultation is very important. I know, because it's easy to forget something like that. I was doing a private practice for about 18 years, and wasn't always that easy to find someone to consult with because I was kind of like doing this on my own. I had some colleagues that I shared office space with, but they were never around when I was there because that was my night to be there and it was not their night to be there. So if you're getting jammed up and there's some kind of impaired effectiveness or objectivity, and you don't do some proactive consultation, it's likely to get worse. If you do proactive consultation, someone who has fresh eyes on this, who's not in the middle of it, can give you valuable feedback and advice about how to deal with this and how to get ungummed up. Other ways to avoid being in trouble: self-care. I hope everyone here thinks about their diet, thinks about their physical health, thinks about what you do to relieve stress. Exercise is something that I recommend. It can be very stressful dealing with clients day in and day out, or doing whatever your services are. And easy to forget that we all have limitations. We all have our own physiological responses that we need to deal with. And if those things aren't at a good level, then we can find ourselves impaired. So self-care is really a key thing. If you take care of yourself, your thinking is clearer, your objectivity is better, your ability to deal with stress is better. Stress management, not one or the other, because these things all coincide with each other. Continuing education, we are mandated to have 40 hours every 2 years for the requirements of our licensing board. And if the board audits you, as you know, you have to prove that you did that or you could be in trouble. So make a point of looking for continuing education credits. Everyone gets 6 or so today, which is a good thing. But I would say look for credits that are maybe not within your expertise all the time. It's easy for me, like I go to a clinical hypnosis workshop every single year, and I know this stuff, but I really need to challenge myself and pick other things that are not clinical hypnosis, because that's not all the end-all and be-all of psychology or psychotherapy. I find that going to continuing education is a nice break from my normal everyday office work, and a good way to take care of myself, and a good way to have a break every so often, good way to feel challenged. One of the reasons I applied to be on the board of psychology was the same thing, because I wanted something different and challenging from my everyday work experience. Self-awareness. I think there's a tendency over a period of time for people to sometimes lose their full self-awareness unless you work at it. I think a parallel example would be musicians. Most musicians don't make a fortune, but some of them become rock stars, right? Very few percentage, but some do. And they become rich and famous. And you take someone like that who was a really decent person, real down to earth, normal everyday person, and all this riches and fame comes their way, and they sometimes lose perspective, and they have almost an acquired narcissistic personality from it. I think psychologists can have the same thing. You're in this position of power, you run a clinic, you supervise a bunch of people, and it's easy for you to lose perspective. And I'm not saying anyone here has had that. I've experienced supervisors at clinics that have had that kind of a thing. So self-awareness is very important. If you're not self-aware, it's easy to get jammed up and start behaving in an unprofessional manner. The rule of evidence for the board and for the complaint resolution committee is something called preponderance of evidence. So it has to be more likely than not that it happened, 51%. That's different than a criminal court where it has to be beyond a shadow of a doubt, which is a much, much higher standard of proof. But when I hear and see on paper that there's 10 different people saying this person behaved this way, and that person says, no, I never did any of that, of course I wouldn't do that, it's unprofessional. Well, sorry, Charlie. Commitment to professionalism. It's something that I think we all start out with when we're in grad school and when we're doing our postdocs and our first jobs. We have this very strong commitment to professionalism, and it can wear off. It needs to be renewed. It's like a relationship that you have with someone. You need to renew it periodically or it becomes stale and it starts to go south. Like I said earlier, if you can honestly say to yourself, my work would stand up to the scrutiny of a strong peer review, then you're not going to be in trouble. And if you can say to yourself, I'm a consummate professional, I really take pride in what I do, I renew my professionalism, I make sure that I've got my professionalism going. It's like a hat I put on in the morning before I go to my office. That's going to help you stay out of trouble. You still might have a complaint, but it's probably going to be dismissed if there's no basis for it. I'm definitely ready for questions at this point.
Okay. What is the most common infraction that is dealt with by the board?
Well, the overall category is called unprofessional conduct. I know that it's very common to see incomplete file materials. It's very common to see things like relationship problems, multiple relationships. Reports are sometimes a problem. When you write a psychological report, there needs to be a conclusion and it needs to be based on the data. If you leave out some of the data, the conclusion is faulty. If you don't consider all the data correctly, it leads to faulty conclusions, and we see that a fair amount.
What is the psychologist's responsibility if a client discusses his or her use of marijuana?
Well, the responsibility would be to assess their use of it. Is it a problem? Is it something that they need some other help with? Is it something that you're competent to provide the help with if they need other help? Right now, our societal mores are changing about the use of marijuana. It's legal now in a bunch of states and Washington, D.C. So is it okay or not? I think it's similar to the use of alcohol. If someone uses alcohol on a social basis and it's not a problem for them, what's your responsibility as a psychologist if they tell you that they like to drink a craft beer occasionally, right? It's not a big deal unless they're abusing it. If it's getting in their way of their therapy, that's a problem.
How has being on a complaint resolution committee changed your perspective of what a complaint is and the board's role as regulators?
Well, it's been very educational. It's something that is behind the scenes, and most psychologists don't see it except for when they have a complaint against them and they have to go to the committee. I guess it hasn't changed my perspective a whole lot because it's pretty similar to what I thought it would be. I thought many complaints would be dismissed because people can file complaints when they're unhappy about something. Anyone here is eligible to serve on the board and find out for themselves. And it really is a very interesting experience and very educational and rewarding too.
Are any complaints disposed of before going to a CRC? Is the first question.
I don't think so. I think if it gets to the place of a complaint, it goes to the CRC. The staff are not really allowed to dismiss it on their own.
Non-jurisdiction. So, can I offer clarity?
Yeah.
Sure. Sorry, I'll just jump in because, so board staff can dismiss non-jurisdictional complaints. That means that it's not it's either not a licensee or it's not the practice of psychology and not a licensee. Other than that, our statute 214 requires us to take it to a board member or committee of board members to review the complaint and dismiss. Is the subject of the complaint made aware of the complaint before it goes to triage?
Yes. So if you are the subject of a complaint, you will get something in the mail about the complaint, and it will have a list of the allegations of your unprofessional conduct, and you have a opportunity to address that and write down why you don't think that it holds any merit. This is what I did in this case. Here's my case notes that show that I did this. I consulted with this person. I did this other thing to intervene, and I did this to make sure there was a resolution of the impaired objectivity. And so I don't believe I'm in violation of anything here. I would also say that some psychologists who are complained against know that they did something wrong. And it's a good idea, if you know that, to just be honest. You face a less harsh penalty if you fess up and you can come to the board and say, yeah, I did this, I know I did it, and it's not okay, and here's what I'm doing to change it.
What are some of the most difficult complaints for the committee to make a decision on?
The she said complaints. There's a lot of times where if this behavior occurred, it's a problem, but it's she said, or she said, he said, or he said, she said. And how do you know whether it happened or not? The psychologist or applicant has no former complaints. They've had a stellar career, there's been no problems, and now this person is saying, this happened, this person was flirting with me or something like that. You know, we want to err on the side of reality. We don't want it to be something where the public is not protected, but we also don't want to mess with someone's license if it's not supposed to be messed with. So that's, for me, the hardest kind of case.
How is an ACA not considered discipline when payers view any action that is public as discipline, even if it does not go to the National Practitioner Database?
Well, I think that that's a matter of law in Minnesota, actually. And when you get an ACA, you do some things, your license isn't suspended, it's not revoked, it is conditioned, and you work your way out of it, and yes, it is public, and it probably feels punitive to the person who has to deal with it, but it is not considered legally a formal corrective action. I don't know that the insurance companies look at our website and find those people with ACAs and then do things against their license. They do find out if you've had a formal discipline because it's a national database.
Can I add one thing about that?
Absolutely.
That's, I just wanted to add one point about the ACAs. That's codified in section 214 that applies to all health licensing boards. So it's not just psychology specific, it's all the health licensing boards have a corrective action process that's not considered discipline and reportable to the data banks.
And it's also different in other states.
Yeah.
It's specific to Minnesota.
Next question, could you please explain the composition of the committee?
The committee itself are 3 board members. 2 of them are psychologist members, and 1 is a public member. So there's 2 public members on the board at any given time. Those are people that are just in the general public who are not licensees of the board. Because it's 3 people, we have to kind of hash out, what do we do now if we found someone in violation? Are we going to dismiss it anyway? Are we going to sanction them in some way or another? And the sanctions go all the way from the ACA, which, as we just said, isn't really a formal discipline, to formal discipline. And formal discipline can include things like suspension of license, revocation of license, conditioning of license, reprimanding, and there's another word that's like reprimand that we use sometimes. Can't think of it. The reason we have someone who's a public member on the committee is to give us perspective and who's outside of the practice of psychology input into when someone's disciplined or not. So that it gives the public some say in that. I'm not sure why it's 3 people instead of 5 people, except that there's only 11 total board members at any given time. And it can be a burnout situation to have everyone being on all the committees. But the public member usually has a perspective that's very different than a psychologist would have. And they might be much more harsh than the psychologists. They might be much more lax than the psychologists that are on the committee. But, so it's 2 psychologists and the public member.
Have you observed a complainant or their counsel trying to leverage a malpractice claim for damages or divorce-related matters pursuing a remedy with the board? How does the board address this in general?
Let me see that.
Sure. I think that means like trying to get back at people for.
I think that there are complaints that are trying to get back at someone. I don't know that I've seen a lot of those. I don't know that I've seen ones that are related to malpractice claims. Custody evals are one where the person that loses custody sometimes wants to get back at the psychologist. The other one might be divorce. That's not very happy divorce, acrimonious divorce situations, and there's some kind of evaluation that goes on with that, and that can be something where there's a complaint. I think when that happens, we pretty much can tell, and those kind of complaints usually are dismissed.
What are some kinds of remedies or requirements licensees are often need to complete under a disciplinary action?
So if someone is disciplined formally and their license is suspended or revoked or conditioned, they have to do things if they want to get their license back to change those things. And I think how these committees operate is that we try and be as logical as possible with the consequences. There was a psychologist a number of years ago who was doing clinical hypnosis to recover repressed memories of some child abuse situations that may or may not have happened. And that person's license was conditioned, and they were not allowed to practice clinical psychology anymore, or clinical hypnosis anymore. In order to do that, to get that back as a competency, they had to go through some training, and they had to go through some supervision, and they had to do some other things to demonstrate that their knowledge and understanding of the use of clinical hypnosis with child sexual abuse patients and clients. So usually it kind of fits the crime. If someone's license is revoked, it's not forever. They can petition to get it back, I believe, after 10 years. If we suspend their license, sometimes it's suspended indefinitely, and there's a minimum put on that, like 6 months or 2 years or something like that. So maybe they have to go to chemical dependency treatment. Maybe they need to retake the EPPP or the professional responsibility exam. Maybe they need to do another postdoc. Maybe they need to have supervision. It depends on what the violation and infraction was. We try and make it something that fits the violation so that it will ameliorate that situation and help that person practice in a more responsible professional manner in the future. The board also can refer to HPSP, by the way.
That's our next question, actually. Related to that, if the committee has a complaint where the practitioner is impaired, can the committee send them to HPSP?
Yes, absolutely. And that would be a good outcome of that type of a complaint, because you know, we're not trying to be punitive. We want to rehabilitate this person, and we want them to be able to practice psychology effectively. So if they can deal with their chemical abuse problems and get back to normal, fine. I also want to say I've seen some cases where I thought this person is never going to get their license back because the violations were fairly extreme, but they did the things they needed to do, and they went through treatment, and they had psychiatric help, and they had chemical dependency treatment, and they've had supervision, and they've passed the tests again, or whatever it is, and they were back to having a license. Sometimes when they regain their license, it's conditioned, so it's not a full license. It may be that for the first year or two, they have to have supervision, something like that, to make sure that they're on track, kind of like someone who's in a postdoc, they have to have supervision. They can't just practice on their own.
In some cases, impaired objectivity or effectiveness may also be addressed with reasonable accommodation. Does the board include this consideration in their process?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I would like to think so. Yeah, I mean, it's about personal accountability, it's about rehabilitating, it's not necessarily about punishment. I'm very sure it feels like punishment to anyone who goes through it, but if there are mitigating circumstances, the committee will notice that and take that into account.
If I am a psychologist in rural Minnesota in a small community, and therefore I'm likely to be the therapist for most members of that community, and I live in that community, how can I be required to never be in a multiple relationship?
You can't, but you are required to resolve it. You're required to do things to make sure it does not impair your objectivity or effectiveness. Right? There are times when you cannot avoid multiple relationships. Having a multiple relationship by itself doesn't mean that's it, your license is going to be toast. What do you do about the multiple relationships? How do you handle it? How do you manage it? That's the key. And I know people that live in a small place, Brown County, and you know there's a small town and everyone knows each other, and you're the therapist. How does people not know? You know, what if you were even in a big city and you have a waiting room and your client is done and they're leaving and they see someone that they know in your waiting room? Well, you're not supposed to be able to predict that, and you're not supposed to be able to prevent that. But if there's some way that it impairs your objectivity, you're supposed to deal with it.
This question is, there was a psychologist who had what was deemed to be a frivolous complaint filed against him. The board's decision was that his behavior was within the rules of practice and ethical. How does the board handle complaints that seem to be retaliatory, I guess is?
Well, they get dismissed. You probably never have to come to the complaint resolution committee. It gets triaged out. You will get something in the mail saying this has been dismissed.
As a supervisor, what does the supervision file for any supervisee need to contain to avoid being out of compliance with the board's rules?
Well, you have to document the sessions of supervision, first of all, and what went on in the supervision. And then later on, you're supposed to attest that this person is competent. So does your file contain information that supports that or not? And if you are not going to sign or sign something that says you don't believe this person is competent, like for someone who's an applicant, then you ought to be able to support that too. I would suggest, again, looking in here, because this tells you, and I didn't look at that part recently, but you're supposed to document the times and dates that you had supervision and what the supervision was about. If there's anything that's a problem, that should be documented. If somehow you think the supervisee is experiencing a problem of chemical dependency, and what did you do about it, that would be needed to be in there.
Is the committee able to use their discretion when they find that a licensee has violated the Practice Act or rules, but believe that the licensee has already taken appropriate measures to correct or remedy the conduct already?
Yes. So sometimes there is enough in the file materials to support an allegation or two. No one was harmed and the person realizes it and they've done stuff to change it. And, you know, they come in and they take responsibility, and we do dismiss cases like that. So, yes.
More minutes.
Okay.
What is the value of having a licensee appear before the committee at the conferences?
So, when someone is asked to come in, it's a chance for them to defend themselves in their work. And we can't always tell from the file materials that this person was in violation or not. But if these things are true, it could be a big problem. And their response to it doesn't address every question. And when you come in and personally are able to say, this is the situation I was in. I was using my billing company for this mental health center, and the mental health center was doing this and that, and I said to them, well, I don't want to use my billing service anymore. Well, that kind of fills in the gap from what it said in the paperwork, and that person's complaint was dismissed. So it gives you a chance to answer to and show how your work really was not in violation.
Is there a benefit to having an attorney represent you at one of these conferences?
I can't tell anyone they should or shouldn't. I think if it was me, I would have one. Because, like I said, it's you and it's a whole bunch of other people sitting there. And imagine what it's like, what the pressure is like at a job interview where it's you and one person or three people, and the stakes are high, right? Well, the stakes are high when you're in front of this complaint resolution committee, and because of anxiety and other problems, you could forget to say something, and if you have an attorney, one of their jobs is to make sure that that piece of information was spoken. So there is a value, it's a support value.
What kind of time commitment does it take for CRC committee members to prepare and to participate in a committee meeting?
Well, to be honest, those meetings can be quite brutal. They start at 9:30 in the morning, or 9 o'clock in the morning maybe, and they sometimes go till 4 or later. And we might have 4 people coming in to interview, and each one of those can take more than an hour. And we might have up to 20 cases of triage, and it could literally mean a few thousand pages of reading ahead of time to be prepared for that. Sometimes I don't have to drill down all the way through the whole file because it's fairly obvious that it's a dismiss. If it's not that obvious, then to me, my algorithm is read further, see what else is there. But if it's kind of like, I'm fairly sure this is a dismiss, I'm not going to waste my time reading the entire 2,000 pages of whatever is there. But it is a serious time commitment. So the weeks when I have that committee, which are six weeks in a year, are kind of grueling weeks for me because I have to read all this material and prepare and then do the committee. And it's a good solid 6 to 8 or 9 hours.
What are the most common issues you see on the committee related to supervision?
Not enough. With applicants, there are oftentimes holes in how much supervision they were supposed to get. So the rule is, for the first 20 in a week, you are supposed to have a primary supervisor provide 1 hour of face-to-face supervision. For anything above that, for the next 20 hours, you can have a designated supervisor provide 1 hour of face-to-face. Sometimes they did this over the phone. It's not face-to-face. Sometimes there's illness and neither one of these people were available for supervision and they didn't designate it. Sometimes there's an effect of trying to average it out. It's 20 hours per week, 1 hour, one other hour for 20 more hours, and another hour for anything over that in a week. You can't really say, you know, this week I had 1 hour of my primary, and I had 2 hours of my secondary designated supervisors, and then the next week I had 1 hour of my primary, but I worked 40 hours, so it averages out. And that's something that we see, things like that, quite a lot.
And then a follow-up was, how can I ensure that my supervisee and myself are in compliance until they're licensed?
Well, make sure you have a professional attitude. Read the book to make sure you got the requirements. Consult. Find out what other people are doing that are doing the same kind of work. You know, just dot your I's and cross your T's. It's really that simple. It's kind of a formula, and the formula is in the book. So if you follow it, you're not in trouble. Okay.
That's probably the last one. What are some of the common reactions to committee decisions?
Well, I think the most common one is relief because most of them get dismissed. So the licensee or applicant comes in and we dismiss this, and they're really happy that it's done and that they aren't in any trouble. When it's not dismissed, sometimes there's some relief that the recommendation isn't a worse sanction than what they thought they might get. Sometimes there's a little bit of snarliness. There was one licensee who rolled her eyes at me when I told her what the sanctions were. You know, I mean, it varies, but most often it's relief because they get dismissed.
The question is, with the EAP action, does the committee ever wait for the civil trial or the criminal action to complete before the committee takes on?
I don't believe so. I don't think so, because
We would sometimes.
there might be exceptions to that, but if it's something that's serious that, you know, we need to protect the public from, we may be, you know, we don't necessarily care that there's some other action. In the one that I'm talking about, we don't know for sure that there's some kind of malpractice. That's my theory about it.
I would say, I'd just like to add on to that we do have tools that we can use to try and address those situations where there might be a criminal action that's going on where the board also has jurisdiction over some sort of complaint in the form of like stipulations to cease practice until the resolution of that criminal action, or if the licensee is unwilling to agree to a stipulation to cease, we can also seek a temporary suspension of their license from an administrative law judge. All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. The next presenter will be Monica Feider. Monica is the program manager for the Health Professional Services Program, or HPSP. Monica is a licensed clinical social worker who has been a licensed independent clinical social worker for over 20 years. If you please welcome Monica to the stage.
Thank you very much for having me here today. It's an honor to be here to present to you. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge that I have no disclosures to acknowledge. And then in terms of today, there's some key points I'm hoping that you'll take away. One is understanding why the Health Professional Services Program was initially created. And also that you'll be able to describe the primary functions of the program, understand how we manage noncompliance with monitoring, and then describe how HPSB and the Board of Psychology work together to protect the public. So prior to HPSB, I like to show this slide because for anyone, and I'll just give a caveat, HPSB works with people with substance, psychiatric, and medical disorders, but the majority of people we work with have substance use disorders, so I like to focus on that. And there's shame and stigma, as you're aware, of seeking treatment sometimes for folks who have substance use disorders. And if you can imagine, among healthcare professionals, this is quite exaggerated. They often think that they should have known better, they were trained about addiction, so they shouldn't become addicted. For physicians, it can be extremely shaming because they're concerned that their peers won't accept them when they return to work. Same among nurses. So there's normal shame, but I think it does get exaggerated among healthcare professionals. So the history of the program and this is prior to the program, but in the late 80s and early 90s, the boards of medical practice, nursing, and pharmacy were concerned, as well as their professional associations, that people weren't seeking treatment for illnesses out of fear of being disciplined by their boards. Those boards and their related practice acts had reporting requirements related to illness. For example, if you were a pharmacist and you were renewing your license, there may be a question, have you been diagnosed or treated for a substance use disorder in the last 5 years? Well, a lot of people wouldn't want to answer that, and that may deter them from seeking treatment. So the boards and their professional associations, those 3 boards, worked collaboratively to develop legislation that was passed back in 1994. The legislation that was passed back then said it was voluntary for boards to participate in the program. And over the years, until 2000, boards slowly started signing up for the program. And then in the year 2000, it became mandated for all boards to participate in HPSB or a similar program. And then in 2006, the board, or the Department of Health, identified that they could use some of the same services that the health licensing boards were using. So they sought legislation to enable some of the professions that they regulate to be eligible for HPSB services. In 2014, the legislature increased some of our reporting requirements, and I want to emphasize that the things that they added in the legislation were really things that we were already doing, but it made the boards feel much more confident that we were reporting specific conduct. For example, if someone adulterated medications, they wanted to be assured that we were doing that. And by putting it in legislation, they felt that that would happen, but we were doing that prior to that. So I mentioned that HPSB is unique, especially nationally. Boards and associations don't always work collaboratively. And in Minnesota, we're very lucky that both the boards and the professional associations were in support and still are in support of the program. We have a program committee that's comprised of members of each health licensing board. And then we have an advisory committee, which has been a really vibrant and informative group for us that's comprised of people appointed by professional associations. Lois Schluter is participating as a psychologist on our advisory committee, and she has for several years, and we greatly appreciate her stepping up to the plate, volunteering, and her expertise. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how HPSB is unique compared to other programs nationally. In most states, there are monitoring programs for physicians, and there are monitoring programs for nurses. Some of the physician programs will also monitor physician assistants, dentists, and veterinarians, and maybe some other professions. Nursing, the nurse monitoring programs predominantly just really only monitor nurses. HPSP was the first program nationally to look at monitoring all regulated healthcare professionals. And this really created the opportunity for all boards to have access to the same level of service. It centralized expertise, and it also, in terms of reporting, created a centralized reporting place. So we've worked really well and cooperatively with employee health programs for the national or the regional health systems. And when the employee health program is concerned about someone, they can make a third-party report to us that is confidential, or they can encourage the practitioner to report to us. By having one number to call, if you think of a hospital that employs physicians, nurses, pharmacists, OTs, PTs, RCPs, and a whole lot of other people, it's very convenient just to have one service and also one number, but also to be able to expect the same level of service. One of the other things that is unique with HPSP is that when it started, right out the door, the legislation included monitoring persons with substance, psychiatric, and other medical illnesses. Nationally, most programs monitor or started by monitoring only individuals who had substance use disorders. And I say this really proudly because in some states, they still don't monitor individuals who have psychiatric disorders, and definitely in many states still don't monitor individuals who have potentially impairing medical illnesses. So, and I want you to keep in mind, because we work with all of these, we often see people who may have a substance use disorder, let's say opioid dependence, chronic pain, and depression. And I can't imagine pulling one of those pieces out and not dealing with the whole person. So I think the people who developed HPSP's legislation were really had great insight into those illnesses. So our mission is to protect the public by providing monitoring services to regulated healthcare professionals whose illnesses may impact their ability to practice safely. Much like one of the core functions of the Board of Psychology, one of the core functions of HPSP is to protect the public. And we do that by promoting early intervention, diagnosis, and treatment, and by providing monitoring services as an alternative to board discipline. I mentioned Practice Acts a little bit earlier. Many Practice Acts still have reporting requirements regarding illness. And for most of those, participation in HPSP, someone can report their illness to the program in lieu of a report to their licensing board. So I wanted to list the different boards for you that we work with. So I won't go through all of them, but it is a quite dramatic number of people. The Board of Medical Practice regulates a variety of different practitioners, including athletic trainers, genetic counselors, traditional midwives, and neuropathic doctors. So they have probably the most diversity among the individuals that they regulate. The Board of Occupational Therapy is a new board. It just started this year, and prior to that, it was occupational therapists were regulated through the Department of Health. So who can participate? More boards, and then there are over 300,000 people who regulated healthcare professionals in Minnesota that are eligible for program services. Currently, we have about 550 people that we're monitoring. And then I wanted to review your reporting requirements. It says the provider shall file a complaint with the board when the provider has reason to believe that another provider is unable to practice with reasonable skill and safety as a result of physical or mental illness or condition, including but not limited to substance abuse or dependence, except that this mandated reporting requirement is deemed fulfilled by a report made to the Health Professional Services Program. So again, as a practitioner, if you're concerned about one of your colleagues, you could report that to the board, but you also have the option to report that to HPSP. For HPSP, we have our own governing legislation, and one of those is permission to report. and I'll read this to you, a person who has personal knowledge that a regulated person has the inability to practice with reasonable skill and safety by reason of illness may report that knowledge to the program or the board, and that reporting to the program fulfills the reporting requirement contained in that person's Practice Act. So, for example, if I were a nurse and a nurse supervisor, and I identified one of my nurses coming to work under the influence of alcohol, I could report that to HPSB instead of reporting it to the board. Another piece of HPSB's statute is related to self-reporting. It says a person regulated by a participating board who may be unable to practice with reasonable skill and safety by reason of illness, use of alcohol, drugs, chemicals, or other materials, or as a result of any mental, physical, or psychological condition shall report to the person's board or the program. So this is a little bit different where it actually requires individuals to report their illnesses to either the program or their licensing board. So in fiscal year 2017, we received 460 different referrals. The vast majority of those were self-referrals. And sometimes that shocks folks and sometimes it shocks me, but I think there are professional support groups that work with nurses and physicians and pharmacists, and people hear about our program from those, but also through employee health programs, their supervisors, and colleagues. Board non-disciplinary referrals made up the next largest group at 32% of our referrals. And typically, those referrals are based on one of two things, either a complaint that the board received indicating that someone may have an illness that could be impacting their practice, or in their renewal application, if they checked that they sought treatment for a substance use disorder or had a DUI, the board may then refer the person to our program to determine whether or not they had an illness that warranted monitoring. Third-party referrals are the next largest group, and again, these often come from colleagues, employers, employee health programs, sometimes providers, and other concerned parties, sometimes family members, but not too often. And then the smallest group are actually board disciplinary referrals. And this is what we don't, I guess, where we want to do early intervention to counteract board disciplinary referrals. And the reason is that those are public. You can, for most boards, you can look up the disciplinary order online. And that can be, additional shaming of the individual regarding their illness. So those are the smallest number of referrals. And I will say that most boards give licensees the option to participate in HPSB voluntarily. If the licensee is not successful and we end up reporting them to their board due to noncompliance, the board may then report the licensee back to the program under a disciplinary order. So in terms of psychologists, we haven't seen a whole lot, and this is data from January 1st of 2007 to 12/31/2017. So we received 20 third-party referrals, and I would say the majority of these were from colleagues. We received 17 self-referrals, 11 voluntary referrals, and only 4 board disciplinary referrals. So the functions of HPSB, a couple things I want you to keep in mind. One is that we don't provide treatment. We're a monitoring program. And we also don't monitor professional competency. When our statute was developed, some of the eligibility requirements, one of them is that you cannot have been accused of sexual misconduct. So, or other issues like boundary issues, those are things that HPSB does not monitor. Those are addressed through the board process. So I am going to, as I describe our functions, what I'd like to do is, describe how I would interact with an individual contacting the program. I would first describe what the program is so that they would know what they might potentially be getting into by signing up with the program. Then I'd provide our tennyson warning, and everyone I talk to, when I give the tennyson, I say, this was written by an attorney, it's long and it's dry, please bear with me. It is the longest tennyson that in my career that I've ever read. And then we review our statutory eligibility requirements, for example, not being accused of sexual misconduct. And then, depending on what the individual tells us, we create an initial plan. The first piece in that, we get a lot of information in that initial intake interview, and that drives what we do next. There are some individuals who are contacting us from a substance use treatment program. For those folks, we wouldn't ask that they get a substance use assessment. What we would do is send them authorization so we can get those records. For individuals who, for example, may have been sent home from work for smelling of alcohol or appearing manic or psychotic at work, for those individuals, we would try to direct them to different providers to make sure that they can be assessed and appropriately treated. So in terms of a monitoring plan or the participation agreement that individuals sign, there are some really basic things. And I want to mention that not everyone referred to the program engages in monitoring. Sometimes there's the belief that we do by people who don't want to be in the program, but roughly 25% of the people referred to HPSP, we deem that they're managing their illness appropriately or they don't have an illness that warrants monitoring. And if you can think of boards referring people to us who've had DWI, not everyone who's had a DUI meets the diagnostic criteria for having a substance use disorder. So in terms of our monitoring program, for the individuals who do engage in monitoring, we ask everyone to have a primary care physician. And as you might know, among physicians, they're one of the groups that has the least percentage of primary care physicians. We also ask them to have treatment providers who work with them on the illness or illnesses that they're being monitored for. And more times than not, there's more than one treatment provider. It could be a substance use counselor and a therapist or a psychiatrist or all three, maybe a pain management physician, a neurologist. It really depends on the individual that we're monitoring. We also ask if the individual is working in their licensed profession that they have a worksite monitor. And for most of the folks we work with, that's not a problem. They have someone that they report to. But for psychologists who work in independent practice or dentists who are solo practitioners or chiropractors, that can be a little bit trickier. For some psychologists, we'll ask them if they participate in a consultation group, and if they do, maybe ask the most senior person in that consultation group to serve as their worksite monitor. And even though I think worksite monitors are one of the hardest things for people to accept in terms of monitoring, they're also the most important. Because again, our focus is on patient safety, and if someone needs to be removed from work because of concerns about an exacerbation of their illness, we need to be able to contact someone who can assist in having them removed from work. Other things that are pretty basic, we want people to tell us if they move, if they have changes in treatment, or phone numbers, and most importantly, they need to keep authorizations current. So you know we can't communicate with anyone unless we have a current authorization, and it really ties our hands. So if people don't do that, we will report them to their licensing board. So in terms of the monitoring conditions, I want you to keep in mind those, I think, 3 different slides that had all the different professions that we work with. So the practice and illness-related monitoring conditions are often based on a collaborative approach between HPSP and the treatment providers. But they're also made based on national norms as created by the Federation of State Physician Health Programs and the National Council of State Boards of Nursing. So some illness-related terms of monitoring could be completing substance use treatment and following continuing care recommendations. And oftentimes when I'm talking to individuals, I'll say, really, the majority of the things in the monitoring plan or the participation agreement are going to be things that you would normally do to successfully manage your illness. It's just we're writing it down on paper, and there are some more accountability measures. The other would be medication compliance. There are some individuals that we monitor where their psychiatrists will do levels once a month to ensure that the person is taking their medications. We'll ask that they follow the recommendations of their psychiatrist, therapist, pain management physician, or other folks. We want them to do random urine tox screens. And this is the piece that is it's truly the piece that people complain the most about because it is, and we recognize, inconvenient. And I often tell folks that we appreciate the inconvenience, but on our exit surveys that we get back from people who are completing the program, tox screens are the #1 thing that they say help them maintain sobriety. They said, I was thinking of using this night, but I knew I might have to provide a screen the next day, and that was enough of a deterrent for me to not drink. And I'll tell you, just as long as I'm talking about screens, individuals who are being monitored for a substance use disorder call our tox line Monday through Saturday between 6 in the morning and 5 at night. If their color is called, they are required to provide a screen by 6:00 p.m. that night. If they don't, it's considered a problem screen, and that's something that we would follow up on. We also ask folks with substance use disorders to attend mutual support group meetings and professional support group meetings. We're really lucky in Minnesota in that there are several different profession-specific groups. There's physicians serving physicians, the Pharmacist Recovery Network, the Nurse Peer Support Network, and Dentists Concerned for Dentists. There are also some recovery groups that are for our healthcare professionals. There's one in Wayzata, and on our website we have a list of other professional support groups for individuals. And again, dealing with the shame associated with having a substance use disorder or mental illness, particularly for the substance use disorders, having peers who are in recovery and seeing that they can successfully practice and maintain recovery is huge for folks. It's an incredible motivating factor and gives them hope at times when they may be feeling the lowest. Some other practice-related monitoring requirements. We may ask, for example, someone who has bipolar disorder not to work night shifts or refrain from working doubles. Oftentimes when people are returning to work, their provider may develop a graduated return to work schedule. For example, working part-time for 2 weeks, then 3/4 time for 2 weeks, and then return to full-time. Sometimes their providers recommend that they don't have direct patient contact for a period of time and then gradually return to work. So those decisions are usually made in consult with the provider. So that would be something we would be calling the psychologist or psychiatrist or treatment provider to talk about. One thing that's important, especially among healthcare professionals, is that they're often really busy and their schedules are not always their own, and we really emphasize the need to manage their schedule so that they have time, number one, to take care of themselves, and part of taking care of themselves is finding time to attend your treatment or therapy or mutual support groups. And then there are times when we ask individuals to refrain from practice, and I would say the vast majority of times that we do that is either at the onset of monitoring, when we're not sure whether or not the person is stable and able to return to practice, or it's when there's been an exacerbation of symptoms. For example, if we get a positive drug screen and the person either acknowledges or doesn't acknowledge returning to use, we'll ask them to refrain from practice until they can get reassessed and we can determine what steps need to be taken next. Some others, for individuals who have diverted medications from work, we ask that they not have access to controlled substances for a minimum of 12 months. Following that, we ask that the access be supervised for about 12 months. For pharmacists who have diverted medications or stolen medications from work, we ask that they don't do the ordering or inventorying of medications, that they must work under direct supervision. And again, I mentioned no direct patient care is something that treatment providers may recommend for a period of time. And one of the things related to that is practitioners who, for example, if a physician hasn't caught up on his documentation and has 73 charts that need to be completed, their psychiatrist or therapist may say, before he returns to practice seeing patients, we want to make sure that he gets his charting taken care of. And then there may be other things that will be implemented at work in order to help that person, whether it's to address symptoms of ADD or making sure that their depression is managed so that they can concentrate and get those records completed. So non-compliance in the program can mean a whole lot of things. You just heard all the different monitoring or potential monitoring components. But one of the easiest things for us to identify for non-compliance is a positive tox screen. Not everyone that has a positive tox screen acknowledges that they've returned to use, and those are probably the more challenging situations. And sometimes even their providers will say, well, I just don't believe this person used. And those are challenging situations for us because we have very objective information stating that the person had a drug in their urine. And so we really try to do some problem solving with the person about how to, how could you possibly get this in your urine? And oftentimes we say, we'll wait 24 hours and why don't you call me in the morning? And usually during that time frame, if they've talked to their sponsor or someone else, by the next morning they'll have acknowledged that they did return to use. Also, one of the issues for us are dilute or missing screens when people don't comply with our toxicology screening. And that can be very challenging because in some cases it could indicate that they're using and just skipping screens on the dates following an episode of use, or it could mean that they're very disorganized and have limited capacity at some point to manage calling our tox line every morning. We often encourage people to do a buddy system for folks who attend the Nurse Peer Support Network or PSP to identify if you have someone that you know has the same colors as you, to contact that person to see if you've missed a screen. We really want people to be successful in our program. And you might guess that not everyone in our program wants to be there, and not everyone in our program wants to be in recovery. So we see individuals who continue to use, and when we identify that, we report that to their licensing board. We do have a policy if someone returned to use and it's their first return to use episode and it didn't include diversion or a bunch of other negative consequences, we won't report that first return to use to the board. And the boards are okay with this. But any subsequent episodes of use, we would report to their licensing board. Anytime someone diverts medications from work or adulterates medications, we do report that to the board. If they're not following treatment recommendations, we talk to their treatment providers about what specific recommendations those are. And if they think that the person is really not managing their illness appropriately, we may report it to the board, or we may work with the licensee and their provider to help the person get back on track. Again, we ask for mutual support group attendance, typically not attending a certain number of mutual support group meetings wouldn't get someone discharged from the program. For example, our standard monitoring for folks with substance use disorders is asking them to attend 2 mutual support group meetings a week. Well, if they attend one and then they do Bible study or something, another kind of support group, and are building their support system, we wouldn't report that to their licensing board. And again, I mentioned that we always want people to keep their authorizations current. Some extra pieces. I wanted to read this to you because the ASAM wrote this, which in relationship to healthcare professionals, which I thought was excellent. It says, addiction is a potentially impairing illness. While impairment is a functional classification, professionals who suffer from addiction may or may not evidence impairment. An addicted professional is thus a person diagnosable with an illness that may be impaired, may be in recovery, or may be neither. ASAM did a lot of work in creating guidelines for monitoring healthcare professionals, and I thought this was an excellent piece. Again, in terms of prevalence of substance use disorders in the general population, this is based on ASAM data. In 2014, 8% of the general public met the criteria, and then 4% of the public met the criteria for having a substance use or a serious mental health issue. So theoretically, we should have a lot more people in our program, but I think things are often managed in other ways. We know that everyone, for example, who gets sober doesn't need to go to treatment, and they may do that outside of HPSP, and we think that that's great. But for individuals who need additional support and monitoring, the program can be very effective. Nationally, there have been studies done on monitoring showing that monitoring increases the likelihood of continued recovery. So we feel, I guess, good about what we do, even though there are times when we report people to their licensing boards. And when I talk to the different things that happen when we report folks to their boards, boards generally act pretty much the same. They will send the licensee a letter saying that they've received a complaint. They'll set up a meeting with the licensee to go through the complaint and determine whether or not they're just going to refer the person back to HPSP, whether they plan to dismiss the complaint altogether or take disciplinary action. So there are lots of different pieces to this. I wanted to also mention, I said that we don't address competency issues, and that's really important for folks to understand. We tend to get more people referred to us who have cognitive impairment, whether it's related to dementia or some other illness. And if we identify that someone is unable to practice safely because of their illness, and that illness is not going to improve, we report those folks to their licensing board. We tend to work with individuals who have illnesses that can improve, stabilize, and enable the person to continue to practice safely. We've had individuals referred to us who've had Parkinson's disease, again, dementia, head injuries, and other things that cause them to be unable to practice safely. And those are heartbreaking situations, but in terms of public safety, it is definitely important. And it's something that we can't manage. I want to just go over with you, because I have the time, what would happen if someone reported to the program, and give you sort of a general scenario. So I'll say Mary Jane calls and says, I was sent home from work because they thought I was drinking. And when that happens, we say, I sure hope the employer did a drug screen. Oftentimes we find that employers don't do that, and that can make our job more complicated. So we'll talk to Mary Jane, we'll describe the program, provide the Tennyson, review our eligibility requirements, and go through our intake process. When I talked about, and I'm just gonna go way back to the intake, when we do this, there are a lot of different questions. We do a brief social, substance, psychiatric, and medical history. Oftentimes this is done over the phone. In some cases, for example, someone may pick up their family member from detox or the hospital and drive them right to our office. But if it's over the phone, in talking about their social history, what we want to know is what stresses they currently have, what's their social support network, do they even have one, and how strong is that? We want to know their living situation. And then in terms of their vocational history, we want to know how long they've worked in their profession, if they've ever have been disciplined by their board or by their employer. We want to know what their work schedule is, how long they've worked in different settings. For example, in the last 5 years, where have you worked? And there are some people every 6 months have changed jobs. There are other people who have worked at the same place for 19 years. When we talk about their medical history, we want to know about medications that they're being prescribed. We want to know who their providers are and what conditions they're actively being treated for and what they may have been treated for before. As you're aware, gastric bypass surgery can sometimes be a contributing factor to addiction. And at one point when I looked at the statistics, 30% of our participants, or 34%, somewhere in there, who had an addiction to alcohol had had gastric bypass surgery, which was incredible. And I want you to keep in mind that we work with healthcare professionals, so they're probably much more, and a lot of nurses, they're much more attuned to seeking gastric bypass than maybe the general public. That was hugely concerning. And when I talked to the folks at Hazelden, they report seeing similar kinds of statistics. So in terms of medical history, we also want to know if they've had a head injury or anything that's debilitating for them. And then we also ask how they're managing those illnesses. Are they taking medications for chronic pain? Are they doing acupuncture or physical therapy? What treatments have they tried? What's been effective? What hasn't been effective? When we ask about their psychiatric history, we always ask about family history as well, and family history of suicide, as well as their own history of possible suicide attempts or self-injurious behavior. We ask when they were first diagnosed, and interestingly, ADD seems to be a popular diagnosis, and people will go through the psychiatric history, and people will never say that they were treated for a psychiatric disorder, but that they do, in the medical piece, they'll say they have ADD, which, yes, it's a medical condition, but they don't necessarily always see it as a psychiatric condition, and the same for depression or anxiety. So we want to know how long they've had those illnesses, what treatments were effective, and what hasn't been effective. There are individuals that we work with who are referred to us when they're on a stay of commitment. Generally, individuals who are committed, their license is administratively revoked, so they wouldn't be eligible for the program. But for the most part, we want to know the providers, what their treatment history is, the number of hospitalizations, who they're currently seeing, if they're currently seeing anyone, things like that. In terms of their substance history, we'll ask about every substance. So we'll ask about their alcohol use. When was the first time you used? What was your progression of use throughout your lifetime? One of the things that I learned as I have been asking people this is, do you drink alcohol? And most people will say, no, don't drink. And then I'll say, well, how about at Christmas or New Year's? Do you have a glass of wine or champagne or anything? Oh yeah, but I don't drink. And then we'll say, okay, how often do you not drink? And it could be, well, I drink occasionally. Okay, what does occasionally mean to you? Well, maybe once a month. Well, what does maybe mean? And really bringing it down until we can get an accurate picture of what their use is. So then we'll ask about illicit substances and do the same thing. And I'm always surprised by the number of people that say they never tried marijuana, but very many people say they didn't. And then we ask about prescription medications. And because of the population we work with, over 300 of our participants are nurses. There are more nurses than any other group of healthcare professionals. And they, as part of their job, it is a high-risk profession in that they have access to controlled substances, which can be, if you're a nurse and you're lifting patients and in a lot of pain, if someone says, oh, I just need one of the tramadol, I don't need two, it's not that far of a stretch for the nurse to think, well, she only wants one, I'll give her that one, and I'll just put the other in my pocket. So we see a lot of individuals with opioid dependence, and also we're seeing a lot more of polysubstance dependence. For example, use of people who are addicted to benzodiazepines, opioids, and alcohol, or a variety of different combinations. We don't see as much illicit drug use among healthcare professionals as we do prescription medication abuse. So with that, again, we want to know if the person has ever sought treatment in the past. And I did an intake recently where the person denied ever going to treatment, denied ever being assessed, denied, and then I got a medical record that indicated complete opposite history than the individual provided. So then we have a sit-down meeting and talk about these discrepancies. And hopefully, at that point, they'll feel safe enough to be able to be to provide an accurate history, but sometimes folks still have such fear and denial that they'll continue to not provide accurate information. And I want to mention, we don't expect people to provide accurate information when they first call us. We know that denial or deception is part of the illness, and so we don't judge people for that. And the same, we don't judge people for having a return to use episode. We know that that can be part of the recovery process. So lots of different pieces regarding substance use disorders. And one of the things we want to know is really what helped the person maintain sobriety. And we've had people who have completed our program 18 years ago or more and then reported back. And the number one thing they say that helped them maintain sobriety was mutual support group attendance. So whenever someone's completing the program, I will mention that to them, that, you know, I talked to someone who was completing or just returned to the program, and they said they stopped attending meetings and thought that they could just be normal again. And I said, please, you know, just keep attending meetings, maintain a sponsor. We don't require AA necessarily. It could be AA or Smart Recovery or some other kind of recovery support group. And then based on that information is what, so we get the initial intake, and again, when we get the records, oftentimes those are very different than the individual reported to us. So it takes some digging, and one of the things that is, I think, frustrating for me is when someone goes to see a new provider and the provider doesn't request their prior records. And there are providers, I guess shouldn't be unexpected, but there are providers that really cater towards specific individuals. For example, if someone did get a DUI, they'll find the substance use assessor that works with a lot of DUI folks and says that they don't, meet the diagnostic criteria. There are sometimes when we'll ask individuals to get a second assessment. If there are different recommendations, we work with an addiction medicine psychiatrist, Dr. Sheila Specker from the University of Minnesota, and she'll look at the differences. Sometimes we'll have people come in and meet with her. She has a really great, gentle way of talking to folks about their use and how it's become problematic, and really let them tell the story, but she does a great job of getting that information from them. So for the most part, I think in Minnesota, we work really well. And can I just see by hands how many of you may have worked with our program as a provider? Okay, oh, good. We really value that relationship and communication. The other, as I mentioned, with worksite monitors, one of the things that we can do is get the information from an employer and share that with the provider, so that the provider, when the person goes to see their therapist, they may be presenting really well, but at work, it could be a completely different story, and those things are important for us to communicate to providers so that they can make the best informed decisions. I'm wondering if there, I said I'd talk for an hour, but I'd like to answer any questions you have at this point. Well, I'll tell you a little bit more then. Of our staff, we have 5 case managers. Each case manager has a caseload between 100 and 100 and probably 15 people. Sometimes that grows quite a bit. The staff range in professions from social workers, we'd have had psychologists that work for us, and licensed alcohol and drug counselors. So a variety of different kinds of providers. And then we also have our medical consultant that meets with us. We're also, we signed a contract with a pain management specialist to work with us because of those cases being so complicated. And I mentioned, there are some pain management physicians that are very prone to prescribing opioids to people who have opioid use disorders and not really looking at other alternative treatments. And so that's one of the ways that we'll work with our consultants, is so that they can talk with the providers about the treatment that the individuals received and what other alternatives might be appropriate. We, as case managers, or for myself as a social worker, I don't practice out of scope. I'm not a physician, but it's helpful to have our medical consultants contact physicians sometimes to talk about the prescribing. And speaking of that, one of the other things that we do is we get the prescription monitoring program records. And that has been very, very helpful for us, because individuals, I looked at a PMP report today and I looked at the case notes, and the individual nowhere in their intake mentioned that they were taking Zolpidem, a sleep medication. But when you look at the PMP, they were getting a whole lot on a way too frequent basis. So much so that we're going to actually seek the individual pharmacy records to determine whether or not really, because a person would get 30 pills one day, 30 pills the next day, and it's either, it just doesn't make sense. So we're going to get the individual pharmacy records to see if those match the PMP records. Yeah.
All right. If a psychologist is diagnosed with a major depressive disorder, is the diagnosing licensed provider required to report that psychologist to HPSP? Why or why not?
Well, I think Sam should answer that, but no, I don't think being diagnosed with an illness doesn't require reporting. I think if you're diagnosed and it's impacting your practice, it may be something you want to report. And I'll give you an example of another illness. We worked with someone who had diabetes, and I did a presentation in front of nurses and explained that we monitored someone who had diabetes, and afterwards someone came up to me and said, "How dare you? You know how many people have diabetes? You can't monitor everyone who has diabetes." And I said, "You're right, but this person was passing out at work, never saw an endocrinologist, wasn't managing their illness appropriately." So we got involved. The individual went to see the appropriate providers, got on a meal plan, got on a break plan at work so that they could take or eat throughout the day. And we only monitored that person for about 6 months. But, and the same is for depression. Not everyone who has depression would warrant monitoring. And we really look at how someone manages their illness. For example, if I would know that I was becoming depressed and not able to function at work, if I would say, okay, I'm going to take myself out of practice for a period of time and go on a medical leave until my symptoms are have resolved or I'm feeling like I can practice, then we wouldn't monitor that person. But if someone continued to practice and was falling asleep at work, not completing paperwork, and the illness was actually impacting their practice, we probably would monitor that person.
Next question is, how does HPSP verify self-help attendance?
Well, how can you? We ask individuals, we have two different forms, but generally we ask that folks have their sponsor complete a form. Their sponsor doesn't have to write their name, but just to say that they're attending the meetings. For the professional support group meetings, they can, for some of them, a similar sort of sponsor or attendance sheet is done, and others, for example, for Dentists Concerned for Dentists, that's a facilitated group, and the facilitator sends us documentation of the person's attendance, and the same is true for the Pharmacist Recovery Network meetings.
If as a psychologist I see a patient who is a student in a professional program, medical school, pharmacy, nursing, or psychology, and he or she has a substance abuse issue, can I refer them to HPSP?
The students that are eligible for HPSP are pharmacy students because they are regulated by the Board of Pharmacy. Residents, physician residents in Minnesota are also eligible, but not medical students, and no other students are eligible for services because they're not regulated by their licensing board.
Would an exception be an applicant for licensure?
Yes. We can monitor people who've applied for an application for licensure. Once you apply for a license, you're under the board's jurisdiction.
Would you recommend referring a primary care physician who is a patient to HPSP if they are struggling with substance issues / depression affecting their practice?
If a primary care physician sees a patient who's appearing to suffer from a substance use disorder, certainly they can provide the patient with information about HPSP, and I would say not as much from primary care physicians, but we definitely get referrals, third-party referrals from emergency room physicians. And I want to mention that the third-party referrals made to HPSP are confidential, so the licensee would not know necessarily who made that report. We never disclose it to the licensee, and those reports are subject to immunity, so no one can be sued for filing a report with HPSP. But we definitely do get reports from either physicians or social workers on a psych unit, from emergency room physicians, employee health physicians, and others.
On average, how long does it take an applicant to complete the intake process with HPSP?
That's a really good question. It can depend on a number of factors, including what the illness is that they may be reporting. There are some situations, especially for pain management or neurological things, where it's difficult to get assessments completed in a timely manner. So it could be, up to 60 days for that intake process to be completed. But on average, I would say the intervention with HPSP starts when someone calls the program, when we identify, at the onset whether or not we would want that person to refrain from practice because their illness is not stable, or whether or not, if they can practice, what interventions or treatments might be appropriate, or whether or not even monitoring is appropriate.
If a person is dismissed from the HPSP program and reported to the board, and the board refers them back to the HPSP program, will you accept them back into the program?
We do accept people back to the program, yeah. And usually it can be a pretty quick process. For example, one board, if we discharge someone, usually by the end of the day, they've referred the person back because they want that person monitored, and they want to utilize that monitoring data in the event that they need to take discipline against the licensee. I will mention, so the folks who self-refer to the program and or third-party refer to the program, the board generally does not know about their participation in the program unless the individual is non-compliant and we file a report. And even then, the boards tend not to want to take discipline unless absolutely necessary. So the vast majority of people in our program, the boards have no knowledge that they were ever monitored, and most don't want to be involved in illness-related matters.
Do you note, next question, do you notice a marked difference in the level of participation based on the way the individual was referred to the program?
No, in the past, we looked at it and it looked like people who self-referred did the best. And then one year when we looked at the data, individuals who were board ordered to the program completed at the highest rate. I think last year, individuals who were referred to the program by the board without discipline completed the program at the highest rate. So it varies from time to time. The individuals who are referred to us who are under a disciplinary order, if they're invested in their recovery, they'd be highly motivated to complete monitoring because, again, they're under an order which their employer would access or is required often to access for them to work. And if they're not compliant in monitoring, oftentimes the boards can immediately suspend their license. So when someone's license is suspended, they're not eligible for HPSB services. But if it's a stay of suspension, oftentimes the stay of suspension, part of that condition is a referral to HPSB and completing monitoring.
Of individuals who are re-referred to HPSP, is there a higher or lower successful completion rate for those individuals?
That's a really good question, and I haven't looked at the data, but my guess is that once you've been involved with the board, and not that the board, I don't want to say is mean, but people, tend to not want to be involved with their licensing board, so they're more motivated to participate in the program. And but I also want to emphasize that we understand that not everyone referred to our program wants to be or is in a place to be in recovery. So there are a fair number. I think last year, just 62% of the people that engaged in monitoring actually completed monitoring. And that was for all illnesses. But we understand that not everyone is ready for that.
Do you see licensees re-self-refer after successfully being satisfactorily discharged?
Yes, and that's actually something we like to see. When I mentioned the situation of someone who completed the program 18 years ago and then self-referred back, I think that may have been the longest period of time, but actually it's not, because there was someone recently that I worked with when I first started with HPSP 20 years ago, and that person self-referred back. So we want it to be a program that people feel helps them maintain recovery, helps them maintain accountability, helps in terms of looking at illness management. So we're always actually happy when people refer themselves back to the program. I will mention that they are, unless, for example, if someone is discharged from the program for noncompliance, unless the board dismisses the complaint that we filed about them, so our reports to the board are viewed as complaints, if the board has not dismissed that complaint, they are not eligible to the program until the board reviews, either refers the person to us or reviews the complaint. And that's happening less often because we're keeping more people in the program while the board addresses or reviews cases, but it is possible.
Can you discuss how you monitor psychologists who may not be complying with all of HPSP's requirements but have not been discharged from the program yet?
We'll work, there are two different approaches. One is having the person come in and meet with us and really having a serious meeting about whether or not they're going to be able to remain in the program, and the other is working with their treatment providers. We found that treatment providers are very receptive to the information about compliance. They know the things that individuals need to be doing in order to be in good recovery and managing their illnesses appropriately. So we work on those two fronts. And we do tell people, and we don't say it in a threatening way, but we say, if you continue to be non-compliant, we're going to have to report that to your licensing board. And oftentimes that's enough to get someone's attention to get on track, but sometimes it isn't. And especially with mental health cases where someone just won't send in certain reports, it's like, it's unfortunate because then that illness-related data that we've gathered goes to their licensing board. But we work with the individual as well as their providers. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, there are some brochures in the back. You can pick one up and you can call us, either myself or talk to a case manager at any point about reporting or being a treatment provider for our folks. I also want to mention before I leave, I'm often contacted by psychologists who want to be on our preferred provider list. And just so you know, we don't have a preferred provider list. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I'm honored to welcome Professor Tom Skolvolt to present to you today on the hazards of practice and tips for professional resiliency. Professor Skolvolt's a professor at the University of Minnesota, and his current work on practitioner resiliency has roots in his own teaching and 17,000 hours of practice as a therapist and his own research. He's given presentations on practitioner resiliency all over the country, and his book, The Resilient Practitioner, co-authored with Michelle Trotter Matheson, serves as a base for this presentation. Would you please welcome Dr. Tom Skolvolt.
So what a privilege it is for me to do this with you. Been a Minnesota psychologist licensed since 1978. Shirley Corrigan was one of my supervisors. She was LP number 2. I have the pleasure of interviewing Sam Shear, person who got the highest nominations for our master therapist study. So we have so many wonderful people in our profession. And so I'm just lucky to be one of you. This work has really come out of doing what you do. And luckily I've been able to be a teacher, professor, practitioner, and then have a personal life, and I think of those three as the three databases for our work, really. Even though we often don't talk about it that way. It's that those three databases, theory and research, practitioner development, and work, all the things you learn from your clients as teachers, and our personal life. And then how you mix those together, I think of as kind of, we're scientifically based artists as we go on. So, but in the process of doing other things, kind of gradually worked into the burnout, etc. Freudenberger's first article, Burnout, he was a psychologist in New York City. You know, a lot of articles get published, nobody reads them, but that term came along and it's really developed from so many other terms, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, etc. So I'm going to go through these different topics And I have a respect for the fact that there's a lot of wisdom and knowledge in this audience about this topic. So it isn't like I know more about this. I've just been kind of thinking about it and presenting some of it. So let's go with that idea. And then hopefully there's some questions and then comments from you. And Michelle, are you here? There she is. Michelle Trotter Matheson is going to do the second half. And it's really exciting because it's kind of more working on things yourself. So that's, together we have a team and 2 authors of this book. Okay, here we go. So this is really an important thing. Sam and I roughly estimated that this group has done 5,830,000 hours of intensive caring for other people as psychologists. Exactly. It's a celebrating. It's a really incredible thing. Sometimes I tell the students, our senses are set up to protect ourselves, right? Seeing, hearing, thinking, smelling, all this stuff for me. And as we know, our job is for that person, entering their life, seeing the world through their eyes, trying so hard to be helpful. It's like I tell students too, trying to be helpful. Maybe your experience is different as a therapist. I try to be helpful. Whether I am helpful is a whole different thing. Luckily, I've had a lot of experience. Chicago, New Hampshire, Missouri, Turkey, Singapore, Minnesota, a long time. You get humbled. As they say about parenting, somebody who's not a parent is judgmental, then you try it yourself, you get humbled by the experience. It's a lot more difficult than it seems. Celebrating your intense caring for others. And you might think about a defining moment for yourself, one thing that really sticks out in all the hours that you've done work. You might think of an early memory. People seem to encode early memories in the expertise space, in the domains they have, things that happen really early. I remember very vividly the first young girl they said go talk to. It was 1967. I was an assistant in psychiatry at the University of Chicago Hospital. I walked over to sit down with her. She'd just come in the night before. That's the start of my practice. I didn't know what I was doing. Tuesday night at 7 o'clock, I saw the last person I've seen as in the privilege of being a practitioner, 51 years later. Your defining moment, early experience, later experience, tremendously wonderful experience, awful experiences, ones that you dread, regret, wish you could have done different. Me, suicidal, 2 clients who killed themselves. 2 guys, both with guns. How can you not regret that you didn't do enough? But we're talking about your celebrating you and how hard the work is. You know, in the research, there's a lot of things, but one is early exit in these careers. People get overwhelmed early and they get out. There are half as many special ed teachers that leave before they get licensed. I know a nurse that worked with people in early replacement of kidneys, and I think it was basically kidney replacement. What's the right term for that? And in the 60s, and half the patients were dying. She left that field never to come back again. So, you know, there's a lot of stress in a lot of ways. But how can you keep going and be involved, and be involved, and be involved, and not lose yourself? So there are a lot of terms. One is one-way caring relationships. We're really good at that. That's good, except your whole life. Celebrating your intensive caring for others. Okay, so this is not a presentation on empirical research studies. It's about combat veterans coming back in R&R and talking about how to go back. I once had a bunch of PhD, school psych, 23-year-olds sitting in a room and saying, okay, let's get all the research and where's your research study? I'm sorry, I'm not doing that. I'm doing it for the combat veterans coming back. So this is about really the good news, the bad news, the really bad news, the good news, the maybe news, roller coaster. Suffering. Maybe that's a word as good as any to describe what people have when they come to you. Anxiety, depression, anger, those three big ones, et cetera, et cetera. But suffering, human suffering, and then for you to be intensively present for the affect, with that affect. And do it again and again and again and again, and to be honored to have such work. This is really hard. It's ironic. We just kind of sit in a nice soft chair and talk to somebody. I was a block layer's assistant in my past life. Well, I was hard. You had to lift up these blocks and do this wheelbarrow with this mud, and I hope I went in the right direction, and we just kind of sit, but actually it's so hard. What are there, 7 billion people in the world? There's a lot of people. The giving of yourself without going numb. Staying open. How in the world can anybody do this? I gave a talk to some medical students in Norway, and then we came by to the Munch Museum, saw the Scream 4 versions of it in the late 1890s, 1910s. And it kind of describes a lot of it. A little bit of contrast in Norway right now because you have this painting, but today is Norwegian Independence Day, 17. Mai, and people are celebrating over Oslo, saying hi to the king and queen. But, wow. Mary Pfeiffer, deeply attuned. Well, how deep? All the time? Sometimes? Really never? Do you need to be? What about Winnicott's term, the good enough mother? How about the good enough therapist? What's good enough? She's talking about the last 30 years. Beverly Sills, famous opera singer, would warm up in the morning listening to her voice. Is it here? Is it still here? Is it still here? It's my life. And down you go. Maybe you don't think caring of the self is the central component, but let's go with that to some degree at least. If you don't have yourself in good shape, how can you do the work? But the work is so demanding, how can you do the work? This roller coaster, up and down. I got a lot of bad news coming, but let's try some more good news. Or some good news. Yalom, the great Yalom, his last book was about going on, and maybe I'll always wait any day to hear that he has died. He's really near the end. Seems like a lot of jobs don't have what he's talking about. We've got that. But sometimes when people get really distressed in our field is when they don't feel that anymore. They're doing work that's making things worse. They're not helping anybody. It's all messed up. Child protection workers sending their kids back to the family when they're worse off, et cetera, et cetera. But there's one. Understanding others' points of view. There's some research that says counselor, therapist, psychologist type graduate education really increases our sense of psychological well-being. It's not that the shrinks get crazy, that they actually get healthier because we pay attention to this stuff. We learn about things. We become more mature. I grew up in the days when Ising's research was really popular. We were all sitting in graduate school reading about the fact that therapists did worse than people on the waiting list. Oh, great. This is really worse. It was some of you older people, that was the deal. That was psychotherapy versus waiting lists. And English, hence Ising, well, God, the research is a lot better. Bruce Wampau, University of Wisconsin, using he's a great mathematician, meta-analysis, just showing how powerful. Not really powerful, but psychotherapy helps people. And what do we live for, if not to make life less difficult for others? International study of 11 therapists, surveys, flow experience, being present. And how about the George Bernard Shaw? This is especially good when you get older and a lot of ailments. Complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. Why not? You know, when you get older, I realize people are grumpy when they're older because actually when they're older, their body hurts. When you're young, your body doesn't hurt. When you're old, your body hurts. Well, you can concentrate on that and talk to your friends and blah, blah, blah. Or help some fifth grader in the east side of St. Paul where the inequality is just blatant. A teacher affects eternity. Eternity. 1918. Wow, there's an old quote. You get embarrassed about old quotes, but when they get old enough, it's like, oh, that's a good deal. Students are, you know, so 2006 is old, right? And 1918 is, hey, that's good. So this is really a model of just thinking about something. How do you know, for example, what is success? It's a simple question. It could drive us all crazy. What is success? I mean, insurance agents, companies can define it, and other people, but what is success in our work? It's filled with ambiguity and complexity. Human ambiguity, human complexity. One is to think of success to some degree as a process model. You know, it's us, our presence, not what happens to the client. It's our part of it. It's hard to do it, but you know, at one semester I taught doctoral students in a seminar. We got a couple of them in here. They're so talented, they've had such great attachments, they work so hard, they do everything, they do all the reading. Same time I taught a 1,000 level course. I used to teach in General College, which was the Statue of Liberty of the University of Minnesota, which is now gone because we don't care about that stuff so much. Really struggling, difficult students who had got a lot of bad grades, hated teachers, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it's a lot easier to teach the doctoral students. And you got a lot more credit. But everybody thought it was a lot more prestigious and harder. So what is success? Well, I was in both these situations. I was the same guy. Tuesday was this class, Wednesday was this class. What is success? Well, I guess I could think about my part as opposed to outcome. So I'm just thinking about cycle of caring. Some clients are so hard, right? Some are ready. You know, Prochaska's readiness stages, 5-stage readiness. Well, it's so great when you have them at the point where they're really ready, as opposed to, I have never thought about this, that I have a problem. To be attuned, to be interested, energetic. Person who is in misery, anger, defiance, hopeless. The person of the therapist, the best predictor. And working alliance, and actually client readiness. By the way, you know, we've kind of gotten over the therapy method wars that went on for all those years because actually they can't find differences between therapeutic methods in terms of outcome because one is investigator alliance really affects things. All methods can be helpful. We love methods. We go to classes for methods and all this, but the method is not the main thing. It's the messenger delivering the message. The basic meaning of caring is to grieve, to experience sorrow, to cry out with. What a great contribution to be able to do that. But how much can you do? Simple idea. Empathic attachment, saying hello. Active involvement, having a conversation. Felt separation, say goodbye. Recreation, getting ready for the next hello. On and on and on and on and on and on and on. Give you an example. 4th grade teachers. In the fall, Rosa comes up, 1 of 25, and says, Miss Jones, look at my shoes. Aren't they pretty? She says, oh yeah, Rosa, they really are. And they start this 9-month attachment. The research on teaching, I did a study in Singapore on great teachers. #1 term for people in Singapore who are so test-oriented, caring. That's a great teacher. You got great shoes, Rosa. And Jimmy, yeah, I like you too, etc. All year, all year, all year. And then they have the picnics. They have the parties. They get to say goodbye. We don't really get to say goodbye very well. They kind of disappear. Sometimes we have termination meetings. Maybe you always do. Sometimes I don't, I'll tell you. They kind of, whatever happens. It's not ambiguous, unsure. Close the door. And then those teachers have this time period, recreation, whatever you call, renewal, because the key is, it's August again. And here's Alice saying, Miss Jones, what do you think of my shoes? And she needs to be attached, involved with all these children. They deserve it. They need it. They want it. Over and over again. And you, with your clients, your groups, your classes, your supervisees. I was at the University of Florida Counseling Center where I used to work and went back and had a picture of all the interns on the walls, doctoral interns. And I talked to the staff because the interns couldn't really hear this very well. I said, my God, they want to get so attached to the staff and have the staff really get involved with them because they've come from all over the country to be doctoral interns. But then what happens? August 1st, boom, they're gone. And the staff are sitting there. Jesus, I thought we were attached to all these interns. They disappeared. They went away. August 5th, whoops, I'm getting away from my tape. Feedback form. He did not do well standing by the tape. August 15th, a new group of interns come. Oh, I'm here from Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and I'm really glad you're my supervisor. Of course, that's the way it works. But how do you keep getting attached, working, saying goodbye, some way recover for those 2 weeks, say hello again? So, cycle of caring. Okay, some more bad news. Is it the first time the bad news or more? I guess it's that ocean thing was kind of shocking. Some of you are going home and say, Jesus, I didn't know I had to swim. You know? Wow. Yeah, some of you are just thinking, should I go bonbons or bourbon, you know, but, yeah. Haunt us. What are you supposed to do with these human stories of stress and despair and so unfairness and cruelty? Where are you supposed to store them? Where are you supposed to keep them? Where are you supposed to forget them? What are you supposed to do with them? First of all, you hear them. If you don't hear them, I guess we'd say you're not doing your work. Is like the capacity for compassion and empathy, is that be like a turtle walking around without the shell? It's such a wonderful quality, but the person's so vulnerable if you take it all in. This is a little aside, but sometimes when I've done things on men's socialization, I talk about 180-degree role conflict, harvested for war, expected to nurture. Young males are taken all over the world to kill other young males. And so when you do bayonet training, empathy is a very dysfunctional emotion. But that's a little bit off the side. That's a different deal. Core of our ability to be wounded by the work. Maybe practicum for us is not really the first course. It's our early life. It's the suffering we've been around. It's the disabled brother. It's the parents that got divorced. It's the stuttering that we've had. It's the suffering of one kind or another. It's being a refugee or immigrant. It's all kinds of things happen to people that make them feel no suffering. And out of the suffering, it seems like you have to have the suffering of some kind or know about it in an early practicum and then start helping and being present to be able to be good at the compassion and empathy. So there we are. We're on the road to this wonderful work. How about the bottom one? Cannot stop thinking about it. Maybe this is one of the things we learn is early on we think about it all the time when we go home, and later we learn how to put it away in different ways. People have rituals of different kinds. When I've talked to groups like this, they have different kinds of ways of putting it away at times. By the way, Lipsky here is one of the authors, wrote a book called Trauma Stewardship. It's popular. It talks about how do you deal with being sensitive to trauma in your life. She said, yeah, we're different. I go to the edge of a ravine and look at the fjord down below in Alaska, maybe, for example. Everybody else says how beautiful it is. I think about how many people have jumped from there. Trauma stewardship. How do you deal with knowing about the pain? More bad news. I told Sam if you see this, you might lose a couple hundred licensed psychologists. Of course, you know it already, it's just language. You know some of the language or some of the terms, but hemorrhaging of the professional self. Burnout, old term, used a lot of research. Christian Maschlock at Berkeley she got the inventory. Most research has been done using her inventory. Compassion fatigue, emotional depletion. How many of you go home at night and you've had a really hard day working with your clients and you can't think, listen, or talk? But you can sit there. But then what does that do to personal relationships if you're not present? I once worked with some elementary teachers. Oops, here I go again. Elementary teachers in Rochester. They love children. They had children all day. And at night, they had children. And the next morning, children. How do you do that? Emotional depletion. Vicarious trauma, vicarious traumatization, term came out of Connecticut researchers, especially young female volunteer counselors who had had trauma histories, listening to female clients, been traumatized. They came up with that term, vicarious traumatization, changing their cognitive schema about life, about safety, about their own ability to be sexual. Really messed them up. Which is not as professional term, but let's go with it, messed them up. Continual low-level traumatic stress. Constant narratives of agony and distress. The ambiguity of the work. So ambiguous. The great thing about theories is they tell us both what to pay attention to. Sometimes I think they tell us what not to pay attention to. So if you got really a cognitive thing, don't think about below the neck. Don't worry about it. Because we need to narrow what we think about. It's too confusing. But ambiguous endings and losses. Those outcome measures right afterwards are helpful, but we can think about our teachers in 11th grade. We could have had an outcome measure the next week, but how about 10 years later, thinking about what happened? They're pretty superficial. They go on symptoms. Sam Shearer, this #1 person, master therapist, said, sometimes I'm really happy when my clients go away angry. How do you measure that for an outcome? It's just confusing. And just leaving, the endings, the unsure endings. And loss. We get so engaged with people, they disappear. Well, they should disappear. But do you ever see a client come back to you and say, oh, I'm so happy to see you? Well, I guess I'm not supposed to be so happy to see you, but I just wondered how you've been, and I have no idea. I would say around professional uncertainty, if we want to get to that, and maybe ambiguous endings a little bit, is the confidentiality nature of our work. Of course, it's extremely important, and we really are careful about it, but I was talking to an architect a couple weekends ago in Denver, as at a memorial service. He said, yeah, I built all these buildings. Look at them. Look at the buildings. I was the architect. He said, well, Tom, where are the outcomes of your work? I got nothing for you. It's been a great career. I have no evidence that anything happened. And by the way, I can't talk to you about it either. he didn't say this, but I think he was thinking, boy, I'm glad I'm not doing your job. And by the way, can I show you more buildings? It's really stressful that we can't talk about it. I used to remember a house ago or so, I love painting all the rooms at night after, you know, students are kind of like clients. You don't know what happened to them, and it's ambiguous, and they kind of like it and don't, and blah, blah, blah. Supervisees. Come home, and the wall was green, and I'd get that roller out. Holy cow, it's now blue. I accomplished something. So concrete hobbies seem to be really important, something concrete in our life, something you can show evidence of something. You know, one psychologist is a rock collector. She puts her rocks out there. She has it all in her backyard in St. Paul, and well, she just loves those rocks. And the great thing is the winter comes and the rocks are there in the spring. No nurturing, no worries, the rocks are there. Perfect hobby for us, you know, you don't have to worry about watering and worrying about them. You know, somebody else is a weaver. She teaches nursing at Augsburg. She gets on that loom and she's like in a flow thing, like a trance. And the next day she goes back and talks to these anxious undergraduate nursing students and was present. So part of it is the professional uncertainty, ambiguity, the confidentiality stuff. There's a lot of lack of concrete evidence. You know, it's really, really hard. A little different topic, but I guess we're on resilience. We better talk about what is it after all. We need to update the 2018, but look at that. Terms get popular all of a sudden. You know, we have a lot of, the stock market goes up and down, the housing market, everything. Psychological terms come and go, but look at that resilience. It's really a popular term. It's probably, you know, could be connected to the old humanistic psychology, Sidney Girard, all that stuff in the 70s, or positive psychology, Seligman, working with those dogs that he depressed because he shocked them, and then he went to positive psychology, and think about him that way. It's a true story, right? You notice your Pennsylvania researcher? These are trees in the desert in Israel. You get a lot of wind on them, they don't break, they just bend. Ann Maston's book, Ordinary Magic. We should maybe have a fancy definition, but let's go with the easier one. Why not? Bounce back. Rubber band, bong, comes back. And it's kind of interesting. Two early researchers. Werner was, she was a social work professor at Berkeley and studied immigrant kids and Southeast Asian immigrant kids to Hawaii. And how were they doing? Garmacy, University of Minnesota clinical psychology person, studying children in South Minneapolis. And both of them were looking for psychopathology. And they just almost missed the fact that some kids were doing well in these situations. They couldn't quite believe it, but then they said, well, eventually, both of them started using the word resilience. Resilient. And there were characteristics of resilient children and Garmacy's work, for example. There are a lot of studies of resilience. This is just one. Paramedics. How do you keep doing that work? How do you keep doing your work? Support from senior people, clinical supervisors, directors, managers, talking about it. getting your own therapy, being able to talk to friends and tell them actually what is happening, not just the good stories, these stories. And outside of out of work too, but support from family and friends. Isn't there an old term, kind of being well-loved and well-fed? Really important. Well-loved, well-fed. Humor, the right way and the right time. Detachment, which, that's kind of a, so look at that research exactly what that means, but what does it mean, detachment? How detached? When detached? Not detached? But there's one study. This is another just way of thinking about how to do this work. The idea that the practitioner sits in the eye with the client, and around you is this swirling stress, difficulty, trauma, problems. But you can be safely in this doing your work in a process model, staying there, staying present at that time with that person. And just suggesting 3 things. Vitality is a good term for us in our field. I believe, you think about all the terms, having vitality. Some of the early work was on demoralization, and clients need hope from us. And the placebo effect is really, in some ways, people would say, you get the body's self-healing properties going, and it's so important to have a placebo effect or hopefulness over demoralization. But you have to have vitality. Personal vitality, professional vitality. This is an inventory we have. Have these 4 categories. Personal vitality, professional vitality exceeds personal stress and professional stress. Now, I can sit up here and say all these things, but I've also had a life. And I know it isn't that simple. Things happen. Bad things happen. Things happen. Unfair things happen. Good things happen. But still, it's a way of thinking about it. Our own vitality. Cycle of caring, process model, being present, be disconnected somewhat from the outcome of the other person, but your presence. And then this last one, maintaining an intense will to learn and grow. It seems like when we've studied some of these master therapists, for example, they get revitalized by learning. So you can learn stuff and you get better, but the process of wanting to learn and grow seems to give energy. So I'm really excited about what gives energy to practitioners, because the work is so hard. Outside, the storm swirls. In the quiet of the eye, they meet. Being present right then. That's all they're asking for. It's a lot, but that's what's being asked. Okay, just some tasks. Not too much more, a little bit more. Get to your questions. Maybe this, you've all gotten here already, but losing one's innocence about the need to really be careful. It seems that young practitioners now are getting a lot on self-care. It's really built into training programs. When I or some older people were there, you didn't even hear the word burnout or any of this stuff. The language helps. Now, graduate students can get mad because they say, you tell us to do self-care, and then you give us all this homework, and we're working all the time. And I've heard students like at conferences get really angry about that. And it's a good point. But if I would tell them, you're making a good point. But I tell you, it's worse than that, because the faculty at highly competitive universities, they don't have any answers for themselves, really. It's so difficult. The work is so stressful and demanding. So, on the other hand, you've got to figure out a way to try to navigate through it. Abundant sources of positive energy. Where do you get your positive energy? Where have you gotten it? Where can you get it? Where will you get it? All kinds of things produce it. The meaning of the work, the wonderful, how fortunate we are to be in Minnesota and to have this license and be in this profession. If you can feel that, it's great. If you feel like, this sucks. 10-point scale, wherever you are in it, you know? Sucks at one end, this is wonderful. Searching for empathy, balance, and term we came up with some of our research, this paradoxical term, you know, the paradoxical term, we all know bittersweet, bittersweet. Boundaried generosity. Think about one way to care for ourselves, one term, generosity. Boundaried generosity. Boundaries. You know, when Tammy, the Southwest pilot, was piloting that airplane, and the engine went, boom, what came down? The masks with the oxygen. And the classic thing is to the parent, put yours on first, then your child's. You've got to take care of yourself. My mother, 93 years old, one of my first teachers, kind of my model of how to do stuff. I had great parents, but she was really good at. You got to take care of yourself before you can take care of others. Boundary generosity. Sustaining measures of success and satisfaction, whatever they are. Confusing. Maybe that's not confusing. You know what they are. You have a system. You're in a salaried position. You have to do it a certain way. Whatever. Clients come back. Is that good news or bad news? I don't know. But they come back. Well, that's maybe good news. They come back. That's maybe bad news. But referrals from friends. Their friends refer somebody to you. Isn't that's nice? Huh? That sounds good. Whatever. A greenhouse at work. It's a nice image because in a greenhouse, everything grows. And so I came up with this idea when I was in a work environment where there wasn't a greenhouse. And then I started looking at those people that were doing well and those ones that were doing really poorly. And I was young in our field, so it was scary to see people doing poorly when they're older for my own self-protection. And I looked at people doing really well. How did they create a greenhouse? So we can wait to be protected and cared for by other people. And I think one of the things in the helping fields that's hard, we give so much of ourselves. We want other people to care for us. And when they don't, supervisors, directors, it's so disappointing. But some of it is, you know, the play Waiting for Godot. It's a good example of waiting for Godot, waiting for Godot, waiting for Godot, and the curtain comes down. There's no Godot. Creating a greenhouse. Physical health, we all know about how important that is. Before talking to you, I was at the gym, you know. Development of the self. And by the way, we should bring out between 6 and 8, we don't have a 7, so The 7 is for you to come up with. This is just a list, a lot of ways to do it. Boy, isn't it great they didn't tear that stone arch bridge down? It was about to go like most other things. The train station in Hennepin, oh, it was so pretty. But anyway, this is negative. What am I doing? I'm getting negative. And Split Rock, there it is. Okay. Can you read the... You're talking together, there's a bird in the air. How's my breath? I'm going to talk to her. Let's see, is that what it says? I'm going to talk to her. How's my breath? And then to the right is, this dog says, the Bubble Bub says, always good dog, always good dog, always good dog. Never great dog. And the dogs in the bottom have a ball in the middle, and they're all looking at it, they're all looking at it, they're all looking at it, they're all looking at it. One of them says, maybe we're overthinking the situation. So, I think the point is humor, right? I do a TGIF joke to my grandchildren across the country on Friday. You know? If they laugh, it's funny. If they don't, well, it wasn't a good joke. So, all of you, right? Just think about the immune system, joking, laughter. But the serious thing is the contrast between that and us sitting in sorrow and feeling it. The anger, the rage, the depression, the despair, the fear, the anxiety. Sitting and being with it so much and being present, attuned to it. Such a gift to the client. But what does it do to you? And how important are the positive emotions? And when do you do it? How do you do it? I'm going to do this as an imagery exercise. Because early on in my career, I did kind of guided imagery and career development, had people imagine futures and stuff, so kind of came up a little, nothing fancy, but you can either keep your eyes open, and if you don't trust your neighbor, then you keep them open. If you have at least some trust in your neighbor, then you can close them. And so wherever you are, how did John Kabat-Zinn say, wherever you are, wherever you go, there you are? Yeah. So I'd like you to imagine a favorite tree in front of you. Beautiful, magnificent, wonderful, in the spring too. Maybe it's not a Minnesota tree, maybe it's a palm tree, maybe it's whatever, but if it's a northern climate here, just think of this tree. Wow. Healthy, strong, vibrant, bark, leaves. Beautiful tree, maybe evergreen, maybe a pine, white pine, whatever. But the thing about trees is they take in carbon dioxide of the humans around them. They take in the carbon dioxide and they give off oxygen, just like you do. Just like you do, taking in the carbon dioxide of your clients, your patients, those distressed people that give off so much carbon dioxide. You turn it into oxygen. But this tree, this beautiful tree in front of you, if you look at it, oh, it needs sunlight, it needs rain. Not acid rain, luckily we don't have much of that anymore. It needs sunlight, rain, and rich, good soil. But what if it doesn't have those things? what happens to this tree? Is it a slow deterioration, a sickening of the tree? Is it like what's happened to the elms in the past here and now the ash? Is it some kind of disease? The tree kind of dies? What about you? Your capacity to give off oxygen. And so the question is, right here in this little example, what is your sunlight like? How about the rain, the water, rain or other ways? And what about the soil in your life? So, magnificent tree, wonderful practitioner, both taking in carbon dioxide, giving off oxygen. But it's dangerous if the things aren't there. So just imagine this for a minute, and then we'll come back to the room. John Norcross, great psychotherapy researcher, writing with Guy. There's no greater pleasure than knowing you made a real difference in the life of another human being. One that never loses its special meaning. We're fortunate to be in a field that we can have this, but it's so difficult. There's so many problems. And out of this audience, there's lots of solutions, ways you've managed things. And let's talk about some of that. We got some references.
So I have a question. If you have other questions for Dr. Scoville, there's cards and staff members around to provide them to us. The question is, how do I deal with a dysfunctional organization and preserve sanity? Reform it, leave it, and list others are the...
Sam, I thought you were starting with an easy one.
I can only work with what they give me.
Good. Oh, boy. It's really difficult, isn't it? I mean, it's just, think about the golden handcuffs idea. You know, the idea that people later in their career can't leave it because they're close to retirement, but they can't stay in it. I think, don't we make, I don't have the answer. First of all, I don't have the answer. And we can get some other responses, but maybe part of the question is, when do you leave? When do you leave a profession that you can't do anymore? When do you leave a geographic area you can't live in anymore? When do you leave a marriage you can't be in anymore? When do you leave a dysfunctional organization that you can't be part of it? Or when do you fight and try to make it better? How strategic do you get in terms of what you do? Being strategic about working on things. Using psychological skills to get the organization better. Or thinking, I'm going to leave, but before that I'll try this. Reform it, leave it, enlist others. They're all there. It's really unfortunate, isn't it? Because what I think about is we need people above us in our organization to be positive so that we can do this extremely difficult work. And I'm going to get any feedback from any of you, but it seems that, unfortunately, it's contextual, isn't it? Reform it. Reform what? How much? How big is it? Where are you in your career? Leave it. When I've worked with clients, I've gotten to a point where maybe this is a simple idea that when they can't make decisions about A or B, it's because there are significant losses with both choices. And it's really a grief process. Staying is a grief process. Leaving is a grief process.
For a psychologist in private practice or in an institution which accepts insurance and has electronic health records, the patient and the insurance industry requisites require undivided attention. The paperwork is often more overwhelming than the patient's angst.
That's a good point.
I find it easier to be resilient from patients than from the paperwork. Any thoughts and suggestions?
Right, thank you. We have two languages, in my mind, that we don't really talk about. It's the language of the medical model and the paperwork and the DSM. But if you read somebody like Bruce Wampaugh's research, psychotherapy is not a medical problem. It's a psychosocial emotional thing. And you find this when people work away from having insurance. They don't, in our field, they don't use all that medical stuff. We use the medical language and the notes to get money for the client so we can actually do the work. We have two languages, the language of therapy and the language of the paperwork and the medical model.
Our next speaker is Dr. Michelle Trotter Matheson. Michelle's a licensed psychologist in private practice in St. Paul. She's committed to helping clients through increased resilience, through self-compassion, mindfulness, and shame resilience. She is trained in a certified Daring Way facilitator and facilitates the Daring Way in group and individual formats. Michelle is dedicated to practitioner resiliency and enjoys working with practitioners in the relationship-intense professions and speaking on the topic. Michelle is the co-author of The Resilient Practitioner and the co-editor of Voices from the Field, Defining Moments in Counselor and Therapist Development. Please welcome Michelle Trotter Matheson.
Hey. Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here today to talk with you. I was just talking with Tom back here about what a warm and lovely audience this is to talk to today. So I'm excited to be here to devote a little bit more time to talking about practitioner resiliency. So as psychologists, we all know about self-care and resilience. We know about the strategies, the practices, some stuff that gets in the way, but what we sometimes struggle with is the practice. I know that for myself, knowledge doesn't always translate into consistent practice. We have busy lives and full clinical lives as well, and so sometimes we can not take the time to think about our own resiliency development and self-care. So my hope today is that we have just a little bit more time today on the heels of Tom's presentation to look at these concepts in a little bit more depth and hopefully just to spark your thinking about your own relationship with your self-care and resiliency development. So Dr. Scovalt explored in his talk that we have this incredible and fortunate task of working with the human condition. And we do this over the course of our lifetime as psychologists. So one of our big questions is how do we engage in this work, this relationship intense, demanding work over the course of a lifetime? So Tom talked about the cycle of caring, and if we use that as a measure of what we're trying to do in our work with clients, how do we meet a new client, develop relationship, do the work, separate, renew, and then do it all over again? And how do we do that again and again and again over the course of our lifetime? So the idea that we're not just trying to get through the week or through the month or make it through the year, but we're trying to figure out how do we really fuel ourselves as we go through this work throughout our lifetime. As instruments in our work, Tom used that idea of us as an instrument in our work, like the opera singer uses the voice. We are really an important piece of what makes our work effective. So one of the essential questions for us, I think of, is how do we as psychologists devote enormous energy to our work and have sources to renew this energy over a lifetime? So I'll tell you a little bit about what I'll be focusing on today. So when Tom and I were talking about the presentations today, he laid out a lot of the concepts and does so in such a nice reflective way with his body of lots of practice and knowledge over his lifetime as a psychologist. And my hope today is that I can help with integration and reflection. So we'll have some time throughout my part of the presentation to talk to the person sitting next to you and think a little bit about how these ideas apply to you and what you want to take home with you beyond this day together. I'll talk about burnout, what's the impact of burnout, some of the things that we know. We'll look at where you might get stuck with self-care and practitioner resiliency, and there'll be some opportunities for reflection there. And we'll take a second look at the practitioner development, resilient practitioner strategies that Tom talked about with an eye towards prompting reflection and thinking a little bit about how you might apply those to your life or which ones might resonate with you. There'll be some time for more reflection around your own self-care and resiliency development, and of course, time for questions. So that's a little bit about what the presentation, my part of it, will look like. So in starting here, I'd like to talk a little bit about burnout. Tom talked a little bit about the impact of burnout on our lives, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. So there's a lot of different definitions of burnout, but one of the ones that I think is most helpful as we think about our work as psychologists is this one by Pines and Aronson. The burnout is a state of physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion caused by long-term involvement in emotionally demanding situations. So certainly as psychologists, we meet that criteria for being engaged over a long period of time in what are really emotionally demanding situations. And sometimes this involvement over a lifetime or over a period of time, particularly if it's intensive, can lead to burnout. So some of the things, the words that are conjured up when we think about the idea of burnout are fatigue, disengagement, frustration, depletion, a sense of hopelessness or helplessness, cynicism and stress, all of these things that of course we'd like to avoid. We'd like to be more connected to our work, but sometimes when we have significant demands, then burnout can creep in. So some of the results of burnout, and these are just some of them, and you might know what they look like in your organization or in your own life or in other ways you've been exposed to burnout. So when people are burned out, they don't go to work as much. There's absenteeism. They have decreased job satisfaction, so they don't enjoy their work. They may not be as connected to the meaning and purpose of their work. There is also these emotional or interpersonal or physical symptoms, so depression, anxiety, sleep difficulties, difficulty connecting with colleagues. All of those things can come in when a person is experiencing burnout. And there can be a sense of decreased commitment to the job and decreased engagement. And that can show up as, difficulty connecting to our clients, difficulty with all kinds of interactions with different people in our workplaces, and then just not really enjoying or being connected to the meaning and purpose of our work as we are usually when we decide to do this work or as we are when we feel really vital and interested in the work. So this is something that we have in our book, this idea of what are factors that contribute to burnout creation versus burnout prevention, and maybe think a little bit about kind of which factors are most alive for you in your life. So on the left hand of the screen here or it's my left, your left too, you'll see these ideas of work overload. So when you're feeling like you're overloaded with work, you have too many clients, or maybe you're not able to see people in a way that works for you, so perhaps, or that's clinically indicated, so perhaps like at one of my other jobs, there was a lot of intakes and it was hard to get my return clients in, so it felt like I wasn't able to do therapy in the way that I had hoped to or wanted to do. So that sense of work overload, even if it wasn't the number of hours, but more so the way in which I was engaging in the work. A sense of lack of control, so maybe not feeling like you can put the brakes on when you have, when you're taking on too many clients, or when the complexity is too detailed, that you maybe don't have the space to set up your schedule or control in other ways. A sense of insufficient reward, and this can come externally from the environment. So if you're working in an organization, this could come from not feeling highly regarded by supervisors or bosses, or if you're working in private practice, it could be, not feeling connected to your sense of meaning and purpose in the work. Breakdown of community, so not feeling particularly connected to those people around you. So if you're in private practice, maybe not feeling connected to the psychologists out there in Minnesota, or if you're not feeling connected to colleagues if you're in an organizational setting. A sense of unfairness. So one of the examples I was thinking about here, like if you're in private practice, or I imagine in organizational settings too, maybe some of the recent stuff that's happened with insurance, where we feel like we have little agency there, this sense of unfairness. And then significant value conflicts. So when this is talked about, it's often thought about as this idea of person, job, incongruence, that career counseling term, where the environment and the person don't have a high degree of congruence, and there can be those value conflicts that can contribute to burnout. So on the other side of the equation, the idea of burnout prevention. So what really helps us thrive and do well? Having a sustainable workload, so feeling like, okay, this is the amount of clients I can see each week, each month, each year. I can do this over the course of a lifetime. Having feelings of choice and control. So I can decide when I need to kind of put the brakes on a little bit. I can decide when I need to switch things up and attend to my own self-care. I can decide some of these pieces. Feelings of recognition and reward. So again, this can come from the organizational setting, so you're feeling like you're appreciated, like your work is valued, or it can come internally, so that feeling of, I feel really connected to the sources of meaning in my work, or I feel really this sense of validation when I see people be brave in therapy, or things like that. And then a sense of community, so feeling connected, even if you're in private practice, feeling connected to like a consultation group or to other people who are psychologists and doing the work in the world, or feeling connected to your colleagues if you're working in an organizational setting. And a sense of fairness, respect, and justice, and then having a big connection to meaningful and valued work, and having that high degree of person, job congruence. So feeling like it's a really good fit for you. So these are some of the things when we think about burnout creation and burnout prevention. So maybe just take a moment and think about kind of where you are on this sort of pieces, and you might be in different places for different aspects. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea that psychological wellness is a part of our job as psychologists. So committing to our own psychological wellness is an ethical imperative. So the idea that we have to do this as a part of our jobs, we need to do it because that's part of the essential part of maintaining the instrument in our work. So there's a quote that I really like by Barnett, Johnston, and Hillard, and they say, "Self-care is not an indulgence. It's an essential component of prevention of distress, burnout, and impairment. It should not be considered as something extra or nice to do if you have the time, but as an essential part of our professional identities." So I think this is an important frame to kind of think about. As I was preparing for the talk, I was thinking a little bit about, and talking to a friend who's also a therapist, about the idea that sometimes when we talk about burnout and self-care and resiliency development, sometimes it can bring up feelings of shame for people if we feel like, I'm feeling burnt out, I'm not feeling like I'm in this place that I want to be. So I want to offer the things that we talk about as just ideas and know that we're all working on this. We're all just, no one's doing it perfectly. We're all just working on finding a balance and a fit that works for us. And I think it makes sense for us every once in a while to take some time to really reflect on how it's going for us without the shame of feeling like if we're burnt out at something wrong that we're doing, but rather see it as an invitation to maybe offer ourselves some more support or seek more support from those around us. So when I think a little bit about the importance of these topics, I think Tom did a really nice job of talking about why it's so important to attend to our self-care and resiliency development. And I think he did it in a way that felt really supportive. As a person sitting in the audience, I felt like he kind of got it, like he got this idea of what it feels like to be a practitioner, and I felt supported in the conversation there that we were having. And I think about, so why is this important to you? Getting connected with your own reason why it makes sense to attend to self-care and resiliency development. We talked a little bit about burnout. That's one reason to attend to self-care and resiliency. And we talked about it as an ethical imperative. But I think most important is why it matters to you. What things stick out that make this topic is meaningful to you. So I'd like to just take a second to have you draw up an image of a time in your career when you felt particularly vital. That could be now, it could be a time in the past. Maybe just taking a moment to draw up that image. When's a time that you felt particularly vital in your career? And what were some of the internal environmental factors that contributed to that vitality? So what did you bring to the table? What was true about your work setting or your organization that really helped to support your sense of being connected to your own vitality? And what did that feel like? What did it feel like to feel really connected and vital? And how did that impact your life outside of work? So kind of taking that moment to draw up those images. And now thinking a little bit about how does that compare to now? How vital do you feel in your career right now? Okay. So I want to now talk a little bit about resilience and self-care. So as I was preparing for this talk today, I was thinking about this recent article that maybe some of you have seen. It's a popular press article. It's been circulating around, and it talks about self-care. And the idea that I took away from the talk was that, from the article, was that self-care isn't just bubble baths and chocolate. Rather, it's a way that we set up our lives so we don't need to escape through self-care activities that are indulgences that we only do every once in a while. So I really liked this idea of thinking about how we set up our lives in a way that supports our resilience and our own development and self-care. So when I think about all the ways we can explore the topic of self-care and resiliency, I think about the tendency to want to go to talk about strategies and kind of do more of a surface level look at what are the self-care practices, what are the things that you do to engage in those things to help make your career feel sustainable and to help you be able to show up in this work in the way that you want to. But today I'd like to kind of think about it in a little bit more, kind of go a little bit deeper and explore how we set up our work lives in a way that sustains us or depletes us, and look at the beliefs and narratives that we have that maybe contribute to us being really resilient or contribute to us kind of struggling and repeating the same patterns over and over again. So I'd like to just share an example from my life about a time that I kind of noticed where I was getting stuck as it relates to resiliency development and self-care. So when I was just out of graduate school, I got a position that was under 40 hours per week. And I thought to myself, what would I do on my day off? Like, shouldn't I be working? Like, I felt like I should, what am I going to be doing? And of course, there's lots of things that I could have been doing or interests that I had, et cetera. But I had this belief that in the world that you needed to kind of be busy and be doing all the time. So naturally, to kind of compensate for what I felt was not enough hours or not enough time to be kind of productive or doing, I took on 2 classes that I was going to teach. And I had 1 day off per week to prepare for these classes. But the classes were in the evening, so I still did have this 1 day per week off to prepare. And on the days when I wouldn't be as productive as I would have liked to be, or I would have fun, then I would feel this sense of guilt and feel like, oh, I'm not doing enough. I'm not engaging in that kind of doing and being productive. But over time, I realized that this was leaving me in a place where I was feeling depleted, and I was taking on things in other parts of my life and kind of overdoing in other parts of my life, so I'd feel pretty depleted and overwhelmed, and often sleep deprived, because that's what I would do in order to get all of the things done. And so I needed to really figure out what beliefs did I have that were underlying this pattern. So maybe it wasn't about me, to use the bubble bath chocolate thing, like taking a bubble bath or eating chocolate. It was more about me figuring out, like, what beliefs are perpetuating this cycle of overdoing. Like, why am I continuing to do that? So over the years, I worked hard to unlearn this pattern and try to figure out kind of what was underneath it. So I really needed to come face to face with my beliefs about hard work and how that related to my sense of worth in the world. So what I learned for myself was that in order to feel like I was making a worthwhile contribution to the world, I felt like I needed to be doing and productive at all times, and to feel like I was achieving. So my stuck place was that I always needed to be busy and overdoing. So having a sustainable schedule in which there were maybe time for breaks or more time for me in the day, I felt like at the time that wasn't okay. So in identifying this pattern, and I was able to name it and then able to unpack it a little bit more. And of course, this pattern still calls to me and can tug on my sleeve a little bit, and I can begin to recreate those things. But having identified it and named it and worked with it a little bit, then I can I've developed a schedule or a setup to my life that feels more life-giving and sustainable. So I share this example as a way to kind of prompt reflection on where your stuck places might be as it relates to your own resiliency and self-care. So when you think, and I'm defining stuck places like what do you notice happening over and over again that has a negative cost to you? And where are your stuck places and how you care for yourself and how you attend to your own resilience? And what messages or beliefs might underlie these stuck places or patterns? So if you can, take a moment and talk to the person sitting next to you, and we'll have about 10 minutes to do this. I'd like to allow some time for reflection, integration, and of course share at whatever level feels right to you. But where do you get stuck when it comes to self-care, developing or enhancing your own resilience? And what narratives or beliefs might underlie those stuck places? So we'll take about 10 minutes to do that, and I'll kind of bring us back to the larger group when it's been about time. Great, I love it, asking psychologists to reflect on something. That's awesome, I love it. Oh, great, okay, good. So it sounds like people really were engaged in that conversation about kind of where your stuck places might be related to your own development of resiliency and self-care. So I'd like to share, you'll have on your, this little permission slip which should have been handed out to you. Many people have heard of Brené Brown, researcher and storyteller, and she facilitates or does a curriculum called The Daring Way. And in that, she does an exercise around permission slips. So asking people what permission you need to give yourself to do something different around one of your stuck places. So I'll give some examples about what this might look like. So the essential question when you think about this permission slip is, what permission do I need to give myself to develop practices to support my own resilience? So an example permission slip might be, I give myself permission to not feel overwhelmed or busy all the time. So that would have been a good one for me, given the story that I was telling you before. Or I give myself permission to really tune into meaningful work that sustains me. So that might look like then saying no to stuff that doesn't sustain you and depletes you, and saying yes to the things that really are life-giving to you. Or I give myself permission to play. It can kind of be whatever kind of speaks to you around this, and whatever you feel like you need to give yourself permission to do in order to really attend to your own resilience and self-care. So you can take a moment if you'd like to write down what that would be, or you can just think about it and decide to write that down at a later time. So we'll just take a moment individually to think about that for yourselves. Okay, so we're going to take a second look at the Resilient Practitioner strategies and tasks. Tom talked about these at the very end of his talk, and I'm going to talk about them again, more with an eye towards thinking a little bit about what these things might look like in your own life, so kind of prompting some reflection. And like Tom said, these are just our suggestions. This is a collection of things that have been identified. You might have other things that are really important to you, but thinking about these ideas as prompts for reflection and self-assessment to kind of see where you're at with each of these. And we'll have some time then to talk about them as well in a small group as well. So the first one is about losing one's innocence about the need to assertively develop resiliency and self-care skills. So when I think about this one of the key things I think about when we're trying to internalize this or make it our own is really reflecting on why do these concepts matter to you? Again, going back to what is your why? So when you drew up that image of yourself as really vital in your career and your work, maybe that's now or maybe that was in the past, maybe getting there again or staying there is one of your motivations as to why you do it. Maybe when you think about or hear about the research on burnout, or maybe when you have touched that burnout in your own lives, maybe that's your reason why you really get serious about thinking about self-care and resiliency as really a part of your work as psychologists. The next one is developing abundant sources of positive energy. So everybody in their work, of course, has different things that bring them meaning or are the things that really fuel their practice. So some of those things might be really having a strong connection to the sense of meaning and purpose in your work and kind of connecting to that routinely, or kind of connecting to the sense of why this work as a psychologist is interesting to you. We all went into the field for a certain reason, and how connected do we feel to that reason if it's still relevant to us? Things like cultivating our interests. One of the things I love about being a psychologist is that we're charged with continually learning and growing, so we have to do continuing education. So what feels interesting? What things do you want to do with your career? So really connecting to that in your work and then outside of work as well. And the third one is thinking about relishing the joy and meaning of the work as a positive energy source. So when I think about this one, I think a lot about gratitude practice and how, if we can borrow from that, about the things that we attend to most are the things that we start to notice. So I've noticed in my own work that if I attend too much to the burdens of paperwork or what it feels like to run a practice or those kinds of things that are more of the annoyances of doing the work, and I don't kind of attend to that, like, oh, what did that feel like to sit with that person who is being really brave during that therapy session? When I can really connect to that just happened to me yesterday, and I got goosebumps and felt really connected and proud of a client for really being brave and going somewhere that felt pretty threatening to her. So if I could take a minute and connect to that sense of meaning and purpose and really connect to why do I do this work? Where are these moments throughout my day, throughout my week, where I feel really connected to that sense of meaning? And then, taking it a step further, how do you bring that alive for you? So as an extrovert, I have all my examples for myself tend to be extroverted in nature, so then I would share that with my colleagues. I would want to talk about, that with respect to confidentiality, et cetera, but I would want to talk about what that felt like or note that. If you're an introvert, that might look a little different. So, but really intentionally connecting to what we do have and the meaning of the inherent meaning in what we get to do. I remember talking with somebody that was a friend of a friend who worked as a nephrologist, and right out of college he worked as a consultant. And I asked kind of why he switched from that consultant role, working in business, to going into medical school. And he said he didn't want to have to search very far for his sense of meaning and purpose. And that really resonated with me. I think we don't have to search very far to get a sense of how our work can be meaningful, because it has so much inherent meaning. So whatever way you can connect to that sense of meaning, I think can be really powerful, a powerful fuel for our work. The other piece Tom talked about a little bit, this searching for empathy, balance, and boundary generosity. I love this idea of boundary generosity, and I use it a lot with clients. This idea of how can we be deeply generous, but do that in a way where we can still give over a lifetime. So where, kind of reflecting on where are your boundaries in how you give and how to attend to this idea of self-care and other care. So caring for the self and caring for the client. And where is that boundary? Where does that lie for you? So kind of a very basic example of that concept is thinking about scheduling. So if you have, if you can have some control over your own schedule, if you have a client that you'd really like to see, but for whatever reason, scheduling-wise, it doesn't work out, and you have an open lunch hour, and you decide, I'm going to schedule that person over my lunch hour. Maybe that works for that particular day, but maybe that doesn't work over a couple of weeks or a month or your lifetime as a psychologist. So that's kind of more of a basic level example, but thinking about kind of what can I give freely? Maybe not easily, but what can I give that doesn't take a toll on me over time? So I think that boundary generosity and thinking about what is that balance between self-care and other care can be really helpful as we think about our own resilience. The other piece is developing and sustaining measures of success and satisfaction. So if we think about the things we can control and the things that we can't control, so we can't control outcome, right? We can really do our best to influence in the best way we can, but we can't control that outcome. Just the other day, I was sitting with a college-age client and feeling like I was, trying to get at this concept in all these different ways, or really trying to reach her. She was pretty depressed, and trying to connect with her and reach her, and she was going home for the summer, so it felt particularly important to me to have her go off with something. And I felt like I just wasn't getting there. But in the hour before, I could have been talking about the same kinds of concepts, and my client is leaning in and interested. And so I can't control that variable. So I have to think about what can I control? What things how do I want to measure my own success? And not success in that sort of achievement-oriented way, but that's success in how do I want to feel like at the end of the day, I went home and I did some good work today. I contributed to the world in some way. So things that we can control are how we engage in that cycle of caring that Tom outlined. So how we show up for the relationship and how actively involved we are in the relationship. We can control that. We can control our professional expertise. If we're feeling like, I don't really know enough about that particular thing and it keeps coming up in my practice, that's something we can control. But the hard part is we can't control the outcome. And as a student right out of graduate school, I remember, or maybe I was in graduate school, I remember Tom, as my professor, talking about that idea of painting a room and how you can see that progress that he talked about today, and how we can sometimes see progress, and that's wonderful and it's lovely, and you can feel like the best therapist in the world when that happens. But often we can be doing, the same type of work and engaging with our whole hearts, all of that, but the impact is different. So I think we have to think about really how do we want to think about our own success, and how do we want to be highly engaged in that cycle of caring. And the next is creating a greenhouse at work. So there are some things I think about for the people in the room who are supervisors or directors of different places or running agencies. There's a lot of different things that we can do at that level to create an environment where people feel that they feel like they can really grow and thrive. And then there's a lot that we can also do for ourselves. So that idea that we can't wait for somebody else to do it for us, but that we can do it for ourselves. So reflecting on, for you, what does it look like to have a greenhouse at work? If you just think about the factors that you can control, if you're working for somebody, and if you have people working for you, thinking about the things you can give and share in that environment. And it's going to look different for everybody. Like for me, I know that it looks like good connection with my colleagues, talking about interesting ideas with my colleagues, getting to really engage with clients where I'm excited about the issues that we're talking about, even if it's really hard work that we're doing, I find some meaning or purpose in that work. So what does that look like for you? And that idea of feeling connected with mentors and people who have gone before. So you have that larger connection to the world of psychologists and the work that we do. And the next is thinking of our own physical health as a source for positive energy. So I think a lot about the research on exercise and how it helps with mood. And I see that happening when I go for a run. I see the kind of mood boost that I get kind of immediately, or if I lift weights and I feel grounded. Whatever that looks like for you, the ways that we can attend to our own physical health, getting enough sleep, all of those things, and kind of noticing where we lack. Some people will always keep exercise in their life and take other things out. Some people will always keep social things in their life and then they fall short on the exercise piece. So figuring out for you what that looks like without regard to maybe shoulds and have-tos, but finding kind of what meaning or what movement has meaning for you and feels good for you. And the 8th one is a long-term continual focus on the development of the self. So I think about this in a lot of different ways. There's the professional self, where we get to continue to challenge ourselves and really think about what's our long-term development plan. So do I want to take this training and get interested in this thing? Do I need to brush up on this or that? And kind of the excitement that can go along with that. And then I think about the self outside of our work as well, or the self more broadly, and really attending to that self-care, other care, and making sure that in our relationships outside of work, that we're not in these sort of one-way caring relationships, that we're also attending to that variable. And the idea that we all know about from that ethical place of what are the ways in which I can get my needs met outside of the therapy room so that they don't bubble up and I'm not trying to get my needs met in my clinical work in ways that end up being inappropriate or not even just at a basic level, just not needed in that setting. And then, as Tom talked about too, having pleasure and joy in one's life. So thinking about, what brings you joy, how can you integrate that more into your life? How can you put yourself in the way of joy? Maybe that's social stuff, spending time with friends, family. Maybe it's meaningful hobbies. Maybe it's time away. Whatever that is that helps you to feel pleasure and joy and helps you get your needs met again outside of the therapy room, so you can show up in a way that's really helpful and focused on the other in that setting. Okay, so I have another opportunity here to talk a little bit with the person sitting next to you. My hope here is really integration and thinking about these concepts for you. And so are there any resilient practitioner strategies that really resonate with you? And what areas do you need to work on in your own life? What areas are going well? Are there any areas that kind of stuck out? And what are your strengths and challenges in the areas of self-care? And what supports do you have in place? And what supports might you kind of access to feel more empowered in that area? So we'll have just a little bit to talk about that, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, so I think it's a good problem to have some trouble bringing people back together. I think that's a That's a great thing. I'm glad that everyone was engaged in those discussions. We were reflecting together at kind of just watching the room full of psychologists and how you just dive right in and talk about these concepts. It's a lot different than sometimes in the classroom when I'm teaching, and sometimes it's not the same at all. So that's nice. Okay, so we'll kind of take a minute to integrate everything here. So, as we think about self-care and your own resiliency development, I'm sure you're already reflecting on this outside of here. But thinking about, that it doesn't happen by accident. We have to have some attention to it and do that to care for ourselves as therapists. And I'd like to ask you to think about kind of one reasonable goal that you'd like to set into action to support your own resilience. So this can be really tangible and basic, something that maybe is a little bit of a stretch for you, but within your wheelhouse, something that you can do. Every time I go to a continuing education thing, I usually find something pretty interesting there. And then I go back to my practice, and unless it's something that I maybe take one or two things away, and then I integrate that kind of into my work, but then I might forget, parts of it or go back to it at some time. So one of the reasons with an eye towards that, I'm thinking about what's one thing that you'd like to set into action, that you'd like to support your own resilience. So you can just take a minute to reflect on that, and then we'll have time for questions. So are there any questions? I think they have things circulating around. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to talk about those things.
The question is that I supervise doctoral interns, and sometimes they come across resistant to self-care as a practice. How can I respond to this in a way that motivates them versus shutting them down / cause defensiveness?
Okay. Oh, I think that's a great question. And as I was talking today, I thought a lot about it, like not wanting, that we're all just trying to figure this out together, and not wanting, these are a particular set of strategies, and not wanting to have it sound like, here's what you should do. But I think about in working in supervision with people around the idea of self-care, I wonder about connecting with people to identify why it matters to them and kind of the impact that it has when they don't. More engaging in that conversation in an exploratory way, but I think that's a great question and challenge that probably would relate a lot to how the individual takes feedback. So that's what I would think about that. Not that it's completely attends to everything, but I think that's a great question. Okay.
Does it help, hurt, or not matter if your social / personal network consists of other psychologists as it relates to self-care?
Okay. Oh, that's a great question. Let's take a poll. What do we think? Oh, a lot of my friends are psychologists. I think I'll just have my personal opinion, not there, I haven't seen any research on it. I think, if you're still able to engage in kind of the joys of the friendship and it's not all about work, I think that's great. I find with a lot of my psychologist friends, we're kind of able to talk about things pretty fluidly, because as you all did when you were talking about the different questions, you just kind of got right into it. And so I always appreciate that with those friends that are also psychologists. So I don't think that it necessarily helps or hurts unless the focus is just on the work. Maybe that would be difficult.